Eleanor Carter slid the wedding ring off her finger and set it down beside her husband's untouched plate. Beneath it lay a folded note. 4 years of silence, and the ring made hardly a sound against the wood, yet every soul at that breakfast table went still. Nathaniel Carter looked at his wife, truly looked at her for the first time in years, and understood she was not asking to leave. She had already decided. Before we begin, subscribe and follow Eleanor's story all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments which town you're watching from, so I can see just how far her story has traveled. The ring lay there between them, and for a long moment nobody at the table dared to breathe. Nathaniel Carter set down his coffee cup with a care that did not match his face. He had been reading a letter from a shipping agent down in Norfolk, and now that letter hung forgotten in his hand. He looked at the thin band of gold his wife had placed beside his plate, and then he looked at the folded slip of paper it sat upon, and something in his chest went cold before his mind had caught up to it. "Eleanor," he said, "what is this?" It was not a question. It was a man reaching for solid ground and finding none. She did not answer right away. She had learned over 4 years that a silence held long enough could say more than any speech. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her back was straight. There were 9 other people at that long table, 2 merchants up from Richmond, a circuit judge, the judge's wife, a cousin of the governor, and the rest of the Carter household, and every one of them had gone quiet, the way a room goes quiet when it senses a storm it cannot see. "You'll want to read the note, Mr. Carter," Eleanor said. "Not now, when you're alone. You'll address me by my Christian name, as you have for 4 years. His jaw was tight. "What are you doing?" "I reckon you already know." Down the table, Margaret Caldwell laid her fork against the edge of her plate. It made a small, deliberate click. Margaret was 58 years old and had buried 1 husband and 2 illusions, and she ran the household of Carter Hollow the way a governor runs a territory with charm out front and steel underneath. She had a face made for reassuring people, and she used it now. "Eleanor, dear." Warm, almost sorrowful. "You're overtired. You've been overtired for weeks. I've told Nathaniel so." She turned that soft look on the guests. "She grieves the child that never came. We all feel for her." The judge's wife murmured something kind. Eleanor felt the words land on her like a hand pressing her under water. There had been no child. That much was true. Margaret had a gift for building a lie on top of a fact so that no one could tell where one ended and the other began. "I am not overtired, Mrs. Caldwell," Eleanor said, and her voice did not shake. "And I am not grieving. I stopped grieving in this house a long while ago." "Eleanor." Nathaniel's voice dropped low the way a man's does when he means to remind you there are people present. "Whatever's troubling you, we will discuss it upstairs, privately. We have never discussed anything privately." She said it plainly, no heat in it, and that was what made it terrible. 4 years I have sat at your table and waited to be spoken to. 4 years I have written you letters and set them on the tray in the front hall and watched them disappear and never once heard a word back. I stopped in the end. A woman can only speak into a well so many times before she learns the well don't answer. "Letters." He frowned. "You never wrote me any letters." The whole table heard it. And Eleanor watched her husband's face the way a person watches a card turned over. Because in that one word, never, she had just been handed the first proof of everything she'd suspected and could never say aloud. "I wrote you 11, she said quietly. "The first one the spring after we married. The last one this past November." "That's a lie." He wasn't cruel about it. He was baffled, and that was worse. "I would remember." "You would," Eleanor agreed, "if they had reached you." Margaret laughed. It was a light, pitying sound, and she spread it over the table like a cloth over a stain. "Do you hear this? Now the girl's inventing a conspiracy. Nathaniel, I really must insist you send for Dr. Ashford. I'll send for no one." Eleanor stood. She did it without drama, which was its own kind of drama. She rose from her chair, and the 2 Richmond merchants half rose out of instinct, hats not on their heads, but their hands twitching toward them anyway, That old habit of men who don't know what else to do with a moment. The judge cleared his throat. Nathaniel remained seated, gripping the arm of his chair as though the table might tip. "I came down this morning," Eleanor said, "so that I could do this in front of witnesses. Not to shame you, Mr. Carter. I've never wanted your shame. But because I have learned that in this house, a thing said between two people gets remembered any way that suits the teller. So I wanted people who could not be paid or persuaded to remember it wrong." She looked around the table at the judge, at the governor's cousin. "You'll each recall that I was calm, that I did not weep, that I made no accusation I could not carry to a courthouse if I was asked." The judge, a heavy-set man named Pruitt with white side whiskers and 40 years of watching people lie to his face, set down his knife. "Mrs. Carter," he said slowly, "that is a peculiar thing for a woman to say at her own breakfast table." "Yes, sir. I imagine it is." "Are you accusing someone of a crime?" Eleanor felt the whole room lean into that question. She felt Margaret go very still down at her end. Not frightened, never that, but attentive the way a snake goes attentive. "I'm accusing no one this morning," Eleanor said. "This morning I'm only leaving. But I'll tell you plain, Judge Pruitt, since you asked plain, if the day comes that I am accused of abandoning my husband, of being unfaithful, of being mad, of being difficult, and I promise you that day is coming. I want it on the record of your memory that I sat here sound of mind and told you the truth was going to be inconvenient for certain people, and that they knew it, and that they'd already begun." "This is intolerable," Margaret said, and for the first time a thread of something real came into her voice. "Nathaniel, are you going to sit there and let her slander this family in front of the circuit judge?" And that was the moment Eleanor had been waiting 4 years to see. Because Nathaniel Carter turned his head and looked at his aunt, not at his wife, at his aunt. And on his face for just a breath was a question that had never once occurred to him before this morning. Why is she so afraid Eleanor saw it? She would carry the sight of it a long way. "I don't know what she's talking about," Nathaniel said, but he said it slowly, and he was still looking at Margaret when he said it. "Read the note," Eleanor told him, "when you're alone. That's all I ask of you. After that, you may do as you like. Divorce me, denounce me, tell this county I ran off with a horse trader. But read it first. And when you've read it, go to the estate ledger for the year 1814 and turn to the entry for the timber sale at Cedar Ford and ask yourself who signed my name to it. Because I never saw $1 of that money, Nathaniel. And I never signed that book." The silence that followed had weight to it. Nathaniel's knuckles had gone white on the chair arm. "You're saying someone forged your name in my accounts. I'm saying go and look. That's a hanging matter you're throwing across my breakfast table." "I know exactly what it is," Eleanor said. "I've known for 2 years, and I have been so afraid and so alone in this house that I convinced myself I must be mistaken. That the arithmetic was mine, that was wrong, not the book. Because the other thing was too large to be true." Her voice thinned just slightly for the first time. "Do you understand what it does to a person? To sit at the head of a table she is supposed to own and slowly become certain she is being robbed under her own roof, and to have no one, not one living soul she can say it to." The judge's wife had gone pale. One of the merchants was staring hard at Margaret Caldwell, now the way you stare at a familiar face that has just shown you a stranger. "You could have come to me," Nathaniel said, and there was the first crack in him, the first place where the anger thinned into something worse, something like fear. "You could have—" "I did." Eleanor's eyes did not leave his. 11 times. On paper. And I stood in the front hall and watched the tray, and I watched who cleared it. Nobody looked at Margaret. And in a room where nobody looks at one particular person, everybody is thinking of her. "Get out of my house," Margaret said. Quiet, final. And she rose, all 58 years of her drawn up straight, and for one instant the mask was gone, and the room saw the thing underneath it. The will, the coldness. The woman who had run this family since Nathaniel's mother died, and did not intend to stop for a 26-year-old girl from a broke Virginia landholding. "You married into a name you never deserved. You've never been anything but a girl playing at being a lady, and now you'll be a girl who abandoned her husband. See how far your calm gets you when the whole county calls you what you are." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. She was not afraid. That was the strange, cool thing sitting in the center of her chest. Somewhere in the last 4 years, the fear had burned all the way down, and what was left was steadier than fear had ever been. "You know, Mrs. Caldwell," she said, "I used to wonder why you hated me. I thought it was because I was young. Then I thought it was because Nathaniel had married without your leave. It took me the longest time to understand it wasn't hate at all. You'd have hated any wife. It was never me. It was that a wife means someone new who might one day open the ledgers. That's all I ever was to you. A pair of eyes that hadn't looked yet." Margaret's face did not move, but her hand found the back of her chair. "I've looked now," Eleanor said. She picked up nothing. She left the ring where it lay and the note beneath it, and she walked the length of that long table past the merchants and the judge and the governor's cousin, and not one of them said a word to stop her, and not one of them tipped their hat because they did not yet know which way the wind blew, and a wise man keeps his hat on his head until he does. At the door she stopped. She did not turn all the way around. "Nathaniel," she said, "there's one more thing in the note, and I want you to know before you read it so you can decide whether you'd rather not." A breath. "It's the letter I wrote you last November. The one you say never came. I got it back." He came half out of his chair. "How? You'll see whose hand it passed through," she said. "That's the part I couldn't say to you across a room. That's the part I could only leave under a ring." And she walked out. She walked out of the dining hall and down the front hall and past the tray where 4 years of her voice had gone to die, and out the great door into the July heat. And she did not run, and she did not weep. And it was the hardest and easiest thing she had ever done both at once. Behind her, the room stayed frozen the length of 10 heartbeats. Then, Nathaniel Carter reached across his own untouched plate and lifted the ring and unfolded the note beneath it, and read it while 9 people watched his face. They watched the color leave it. They watched him read it a second time. They watched him look up, not at the door his wife had gone through, but down the table at his aunt. "Margaret," he said. His voice had gone very strange, very quiet. "There is a letter folded inside this note, in Eleanor's hand, dated the 12th of November. He turned the pages in his fingers as if they might bite. "It's a letter she wrote to me, warning me that money was leaving Cedar Ford and Carter Hollow both, and that the account books had been altered, and that she feared to say so aloud because—" His throat worked. "Because she feared what you'd do to her if she did." "She's unwell," Margaret said. "She's told you herself she imagined—" "She never told me she imagined anything." Nathaniel stood, and when he stood, the whole table felt the weight of the master of the house come into the room for the first time that morning, and it had not been there before, and everyone understood suddenly that it had not been there in a long while. "She said she wrote me 11 letters. I called her a liar to her face in front of my guests. And now I am holding one of those 11 letters, sealed and dated, and never opened by me, except the seal is broken, Margaret. It's been opened. It's been read. It was read by someone before it ever reached the tray, and then it was kept, and it never came to me at all." "You cannot possibly believe—" "Whose hand?" Nathaniel's voice cracked across the table like a whip, and every guest flinched. "She said in the note I'd see whose hand it passed through. There's a name written on the back of my wife's letter in ink in a hand I have known my whole life. Do you want me to read it aloud, Margaret, in front of Judge Pruitt, or will you tell them yourself?" The room did not breathe. Margaret Caldwell looked at her nephew, and for one long moment the two of them stood at either end of that table, with 4 years and a great deal of money between them. And then the mask which had slipped only twice all morning came fully down over her face and did not come off again. "You're going to take the word of a jealous barren girl," she said, cold and even, "over the woman who raised you and kept this family from ruin while you were off playing merchant in Norfolk. Read the name then. Read whatever she's forged. And when this county has finished laughing at Nathaniel Carter, The man who let his wife walk out the front door and then accused his own blood on the strength of a note she planted under a ring. You come find me. You'll owe me an apology, and I'll be gracious about it. I always am. She smoothed her skirts. She nodded to the judge's wife with perfect composure, and she walked out of the dining hall as though she had won, because she had learned long ago that the way you leave a room decides how people remember what happened in it. But Nathaniel Carter was not watching her leave. He was standing at the head of his own table, holding a letter dated November of the year before, a letter in his wife's careful hand. A letter he had sworn 10 minutes ago had never existed, and he was reading the last line of it over and over, and it said, I am not asking you to love me better, Nathaniel. I stopped asking that a year ago. I am only asking you to open your eyes before there is nothing left of us to save. But you won't read this. Someone will take it before you can. And that is how I will know at last exactly how alone I am in your house. Judge Pruitt rose slowly to his feet. He was an old man, and he had seen a great many families come apart, and he knew the sound a foundation makes when it finally gives. Nathaniel, he said, son, look at me. Nathaniel looked up. That letter, the judge said. Is it truly 2 years dated? November last, not 2 years, 8 months. Nathaniel's voice had gone hollow. 8 months ago, my wife wrote me a warning I never received because someone in this house took it off the tray and read it and hid it and let me go on believing my accounts were sound and my wife was merely quiet. 8 months, Judge, and this morning I called her a liar. Then I'd counsel you, said Judge Pruitt, not to sit in that chair another minute, because whatever's rotted in this house has had 8 months more time to rot, and if what that girl said about the Cedar Ford ledger is true, you don't have the luxury of your pride. He picked up his hat. He turned it once in his hands. I've known you since you were a boy. I liked your father. So I'll tell you the truth, the way she told it to you plain. That was the bravest thing I have watched a woman do in 40 years on the bench. She walked out of the softest life in this county with nothing but a note and her own good name, knowing full well what would be said of her. A woman doesn't do that over a grievance. She does it over the truth. He set the hat on his head. The question you've got to answer and answer fast is whether you're the kind of man worth her doing it for. I confess I don't yet know. I don't reckon you do either. He nodded to the room, and he left. One by one the others followed the merchants. The governor's cousin, the judge's pale and shaken wife, each of them murmuring their leave. Each of them not quite meeting Nathaniel's eye, and each of them carrying out the front door, the memory of a calm woman who did not weep exactly as Eleanor had intended. And then the great dining hall of Carter Hollow was empty, and Nathaniel Carter stood alone at the head of a table set for 10, with his wife's ring in one hand and her letter in the other, and the whole silent house pressing down on him. He read the name on the back of the letter one more time. Then he set the ring down very carefully on the white cloth as though it were something living, and he walked not upstairs, not after his aunt, but down the long hall toward the study, where the estate ledgers were kept. The ledgers he had trusted to other hands for 4 years, because he was a busy man, and there had always been someone to keep the books, someone he had never once thought to doubt. His hand was not steady on the study door. He had married Eleanor Whitmore because it was a sound match, and she was clever and calm, and would not embarrass him, and he had told himself over the years that this was a good enough foundation for a marriage, that affection was a luxury, and respect was enough, and that a quiet wife was a contented one. He had believed all of it. He had believed it that very morning, buttering bread he never ate, reading a letter from Norfolk, a man entirely at peace inside a house that was quietly devouring him. He opened the ledger to the year 1814. He found the entry for the timber sale at Cedar Ford, and he found, beside a sum of money he had never seen enter any account of his, a signature Eleanor Carter, written in a hand that was not his wife's. Written by someone who had studied her hand and gotten it almost right. Almost, but not quite, because the E was wrong. The E had always been distinctive when Eleanor wrote it, and whoever had forged it had never once bothered to truly look at the woman they were stealing from. Nathaniel Carter sat down slowly in the study chair. He was 34 years old and wealthy, and respected in 3 counties, and he had just understood all at once and far too late that the safest room in his house had been the one he never entered, and the loneliest person under his roof had been the one who bore his name, and that his wife had not left him this morning at all. She had escaped him, and somewhere out on the Richmond Road, in the white heat of a Virginia July, Eleanor Carter walked with her chin level and her hands empty and her name her own again, carrying with her the one thing that House had never managed to take the truth and the courage finally to say it out loud. The Richmond Road ran straight for a mile past the Carterland, before it bent east toward the river, and Eleanor Carter walked every foot of that mile without once looking back, because she had promised herself in the front hall that she would not, and a woman who had kept her word to no one for 4 years meant to keep it at least to herself. She was near the bend when she heard the wagon behind her. "Eleanor Whitmore, you stop right there this instant." She knew the voice before she turned. Abigail Monroe hauled back on the reins with both hands, and the mare came up short in a cloud of July dust, and Abigail sat there in the seat looking down at her oldest friend with an expression caught somewhere between fury and heartbreak. "You walked," Abigail said. "You walked out of that house and down this road in this heat with no bonnet and no bag and no word to a living soul, and I had to hear it from the Pruitt boy who saw you pass, and I want you to know I have never been so angry at you in all my life. Get up in this wagon." "I couldn't send word." Eleanor's voice was steadier than she felt. There was no one to carry it who wouldn't have carried it to her first. Abigail's face changed at that. "To her," she repeated. "To Margaret. Get me away from here, Abby. Please. And I'll tell you all of it. I'll tell you the whole of it, and then you'll understand why I couldn't send word, and why I walked, and why I'll never set foot in that house again unless it's on my own terms." Eleanor put her hand on the wagon rail, and only now, with a friend in front of her and the estate behind her, did she let her fingers show how badly they had wanted to shake. "But get me away first, before someone comes after me to bring me back gentle. She'll try that first. Gentle." Abigail reached down and took her hand and near about hauled her up into the seat. "Nobody is bringing you anywhere you don't want to go, not while there's breath in me." They did not speak again until the Carter fences had fallen away behind them and the road had swallowed the last chimney of Carter Hollow. And then Abigail said quiet, watching the mare's ears, "Tell me he didn't raise a hand to you. Because if he did, I'll turn this wagon around and take a horsewhip to Nathaniel Carter, myself respectable or no. He never touched me." Eleanor watched the road. "That was almost the worst of it, Abby. 4 years and he never touched me and never struck me and never said an unkind word he'd have called unkind. He just never saw me. I could have caught fire at that table and he'd have finished his letter first. A woman can survive a cruel husband. There's a shape to that, at least a thing to push against. But a husband who simply forgets you're in the room." She stopped. "There's no pushing against fog. And the ant." "The ant," Eleanor said, "is not fog." And something in the way she said it made Abigail Monroe go cold in the summer heat. The Monroe farm sat 8 miles off a modest place by Carter standards, a good house and 40 acres, and a husband 3 years dead, who had left Abigail the land free and clear and the spine to hold it. She got Eleanor inside and sat her at the kitchen table and put a cup of cider in front of her and stood over her with her arms folded until Eleanor drank some. "Now," Abigail said, sitting across from her. "The whole of it, from the front." Eleanor turned the cup in her hands. "You remember when I married him, you told me not to." "I told you a match made in a lawyer's office keeps a lawyer's warmth, and I stand by it, and I'm sorry for it because I never wanted to be right. You weren't wrong about the coldness, but I could have borne coldness. It was the other thing I never saw coming." Eleanor set the cup down. 2 years ago, I started keeping the household books. Not the estate ledgers, mind, those were always Margaret's, always had been since before I came, and I never questioned it because, why would I? The household accounts only. The kitchen, the linens, the wages for the house staff. Small things. And I was good at it, Abby. My father taught me sums before he taught me my letters, and the numbers started to bother me. "What numbers?" "The wages." Eleanor leaned forward. There were 4 field hands drawing pay at Cedar Ford that I never once laid eyes on. Now that's the far property, I grant you. I'd no cause to see the Cedar Ford hands. But I did the marketing. I knew what came into that kitchen and what it cost. And I knew 4 grown men eating on that land would show in the flour and the salt pork orders, and it never did. There were wages going out for men who weren't eating. So either the Carters were paying phantoms, or somebody was drawing 4 men's wages and pocketing them. Abigail had gone very still. "You said nothing." "I said something." Eleanor's mouth twisted. "That's the whole tragedy of it. I said something. I went to Margaret because she kept those books, and I thought surely there's an explanation. Surely I've misread it. And I laid the figures out for her plain and polite, and I asked, and do you know what she did?" "Tell me." She smiled. She said, "Eleanor, dear, you've a fine head for a housewife's accounts, but the estate is a great deal more complex than a linen closet, and there are arrangements your husband makes that neither of us is meant to understand. Best not to trouble him with the marketing." And she patted my hand. Eleanor's voice went flat. And 3 days later, my letter to Nathaniel, the first of the 11, the one where I mentioned gently that I'd noticed something in the Cedar Ford wages. I thought he ought to look at that letter, never reached him. I know it didn't, because I watched his face when it would have. Nothing. He came to dinner and asked me nothing, and I understood he'd never seen it. She took it. She took it. And I told myself I was being foolish. That letters go astray. That I'd made a fuss over nothing and Margaret was only sparing my husband a housewife's fretting. Eleanor pressed her hand flat on the table. I made excuses for her, Abby. For 2 years I made excuses because the alternative was too large and too frightening, and I was alone in that house with no one to say it to. And every excuse I made she counted. She learned exactly how much I'd swallow. She learned I'd rather doubt my own eyes than accuse her, and she built on it. Abigail reached across and covered Eleanor's hand with her own. How much? I don't know the whole of it. That's what I couldn't get to the estate ledgers. She never let them out of the study, and the study was Nathaniel's, and Nathaniel was never in it, and I'd no reason a wife could give to go turning her husband's account books without his leave. But I got close this spring. She fell ill in April. Do you remember the fever that went round, and for 4 days she kept to her room, and for 4 days I was mistress of that house in fact, and not just in name. You got into the study. I got into the study. A ghost of something crossed Eleanor's face that was almost a smile and was mostly grief. One afternoon while she slept, and I found the 1814 ledger, and I turned to Cedar Ford, and there was a timber sale, Abby. A great stand of oak and cedar sold off to a shipbuilder down at the yards for a sum of money that would have kept this whole county in bread for a year, and it was signed. The receipt of payment was signed, with my name. Abigail's cup stopped halfway to her lips. Your name, my name, Eleanor Carter. On a sale I never made for money. I never saw in a hand that was almost mine and wasn't. Eleanor's voice dropped. She'd been using my name, Abby, not Nathaniel's mine. Because if the money ever came up short, if anyone ever came asking, the trail wouldn't lead to the aunt who kept the books. It would lead to the wife. To the girl who married into money and might well have got greedy. She wasn't only stealing. She was building me a gallows to stand on when the day came. The kitchen was silent, but for the tick of the mantel clock. That's when you started to be afraid, Abigail said softly. That's when I started to be afraid. Because I understood then that I wasn't dealing with a woman who'd skimmed a little from the wages. I was dealing with a woman who'd thought it through. Years ahead. A woman who'd looked at me across the dinner table smiling and seen not a niece, but a scapegoat she was raising up, careful the way you'd raise a hog for slaughter. Eleanor pulled her hand back and pressed it to her mouth a moment. And who could I tell Nathaniel? My letters didn't reach him, and my words at table didn't land. The judge. On what proof a signature that looked like mine in a ledger that would say, I signed it, I'd have been arresting myself. My own father was 3 years in his grave. I had you, Abby, but I couldn't bring this down on your house. So I did the only thing left to a woman with no voice anyone would hear. You got proof. I got proof. Slowly. Carefully. Over months while she watched me the way she watches everyone, waiting for me to be difficult so she could tell my husband I was mad. Eleanor stood and crossed to the window and stood with her back to it, and for the first time there was iron in her voice and no fear in it at all. I copied that timber receipt in my own hand so I could show the forgery beside the true article and let any man alive see the E was wrong. I kept the household books so clean and so exact that no soul could ever say Eleanor Carter didn't know her way around an honest account. And this past spring, I got the last piece, the one I've been carrying next to my heart for 6 weeks, not daring to use. The letter, Abigail said. The one under the ring. Eleanor turned. You know about the ring? The whole county'll know about the ring by nightfall. Eleanor, you did it in front of Judge Pruitt and 2 Richmond merchants. Word travels. Abigail leaned forward. What was in the note? What did you leave him? I left him the letter I wrote him in November. Eleanor came back to the table and sat, and she laced her fingers together tight. The last of the 11. The one where I finally set it all down, plain the wages, the timber, the forgery, all of it, and told him I feared to say it aloud, because I feared what she'd do. I wrote it, and I sealed it, and I set it on the tray. And then I waited. Not to see if he'd read it, I knew he wouldn't. I waited to see who'd take it. So the next morning before dawn, I came down, and I hid in the front hall behind the long curtain, like a thief in my own house, and I watched the tray. And she came. Eleanor's voice had gone very quiet. Margaret came down before the house was awake in her wrapper, and she went straight to that tray as if she'd done it 100 times, and she took my letter and she broke the seal and she read it standing right there in the gray light. And Eleanor's composure cracked just at the edge. She smiled. She read that I was frightened of her, that I knew what she'd done, that I was begging my own husband to save me from her, and she smiled like a woman reading good news. And then she folded it up and put it in her pocket and went back upstairs. And I stood behind that curtain with my hand over my mouth, and I understood that I could scream the truth from the roof of that house, and no one would come, because the one person who was supposed to protect me had a wife-shaped hole where his attention ought to be, and the person filling that hole meant to see me hang. Abigail had tears standing in her eyes. How did you get the letter back? I stole it back. And now the ghost smile returned fiercer. 3 weeks ago. She keeps her private papers in a lap desk in her room locked, and she wears the key, but she takes it off to bathe. And an old woman who's fallen ill once already that year takes a long bath on a Sunday when the house is at church. I stayed home with a headache. I've a fine head for a housewife's accounts and a finer one for waiting. She let out a breath. I opened her desk and I found my letter seal broken, tucked in with a stack of others. I hadn't the time to read, but I saw enough, Abby. I saw enough to know my 11 weren't the only letters in that desk that were never meant to reach the man they were addressed to. And on the back of mine, in her own hand, she'd written a note to herself. A reminder. Cool as you please. It said, E-suspects Cedar Ford. Watch her. If pressed, the forged sale is her doing. She signed it, not I. The clock ticked. Abigail's breath had gone shallow. She wrote it down, Abigail whispered. She wrote down that she meant to blame you. She wrote it down. Eleanor nodded slowly. In her own hand on the back of my own letter above her own reminder to herself. And that, Abby, that is the thing I left under the ring this morning. Not the whole letter alone. The letter with her hand on the back of it. My words in front, her guilt behind, and the two of them impossible to separate because she wrote her confession on the reverse of my accusation. Eleanor's voice shook with something that was no longer fear at all. 4 years she never once looked at me long enough to learn my E. And this morning I finally used the one thing she never bothered to see. For a long moment, Abigail Monroe could not speak. When she did, her voice came out rough. "He's reading it right now. Nathaniel. As we sit here. He read it an hour ago," Eleanor said. "In front of the judge. That was the whole point. If I'd left it for him alone, she'd have found a way to take it before he woke to what it was told him. I forged her hand this time, turned it round on me the way she turns everything. But she can't stand in front of Judge Pruitt and both those merchants and unring a bell that's already rung." She looked down at her bare hand at the pale band of skin where a ring had sat for 4 years. "I didn't leave him under that ring, Abby. I left the truth under it. There's a difference, and I'll thank you to remember it because folks are going to say, I walked out on my husband, and I want at least one soul in this world to know I walked out on a lie." Abigail Rose came round the table and put her arms around her friend and Eleanor Carter, who had not wept at the breakfast table in front of a circuit judge, wept now in a farm kitchen with her oldest friend's arms around her, the hard, quiet tears of a woman who has finally set down a weight she carried alone too long. "You'll stay here," Abigail said fiercely into her hair, "as long as it takes. This is your home now. Let them come. Let all of them come." And back at Carter Hollow, someone was coming, but not for Eleanor. Nathaniel Carter had not left the study since the guests departed. He sat with the 1814 ledger open before him, and the forged receipt beside it, and his wife's letter laid flat under his 2 hands. And he read the forgery, and he read the true copy Eleanor had left folded with it, and he looked from one Eleanor Carter to the other, until his eyes ached, and there was no unseeing it. The E was wrong. His wife wrote her E with a little backward hook at the top, a small proud flourish he had watched her make 10,000 times across account books and letters, and the flyleaf of the Bible where she'd entered their marriage, and the E in his ledger had no hook. It was a stranger's E. It was a careful patient, almost right stranger's E, and he knew whose patience it was, because he had watched that same patience raise him from a motherless boy, and he had trusted it his whole life the way a man trusts the ground. He was still sitting there when the study door opened without a knock. "You've missed your dinner," Margaret said. "The whole house is in an uproar, and you've sat in here since noon." This is exactly what she wanted Nathaniel. To set you against your own family and then sit back and watch you tear it apart. I've seen it in her from the first. Nathaniel did not look up. "Come in and shut the door." "I'll not be spoken to like a—" "Shut the door." And something in his voice, flat ledger flat, a voice she had never once heard from him in 34 years, made her shut it. He turned the ledger so it faced her. "Explain the timber sale at Cedar Ford." "That's estate business. You've never troubled yourself with—" "I'm troubling myself now. Explain it." Margaret came a few steps closer and glanced at the page with an ease so perfect it was almost admirable. "Cedar Ford, yes. We sold off the oak stand in 14. You'll recall the shipyards were paying handsome that year with the war on. A tidy sum. It went to the land improvements at the South Quarter, the new drainage whose name is on the receipt of payment." A pause. Just a beat. If he had not been looking for it, he would have missed it, and he had spent 34 years not looking for it. "Yours, I should think. Or mine as I keep the books. It's Eleanor's name." Nathaniel set his finger on it. "My wife signed for a sum of money in 1814. In this book. In your keeping. And my wife tells me she never made that sale, and never saw that money, and never signed that book. And I've been sitting here 3 hours, Margaret, and I've compared this signature to a dozen I know for certain are hers, and I have to tell you—" His voice thickened, and he pushed through it. "I have to tell you, it is not her hand. It is a good hand. It is a hand that studied hers close. But it is not her hand, and there is only one other person in this house who has kept these books and known this signature and had the years to learn it." Margaret's face did not move. "You're accusing me. I'm asking you to explain the receipt." "I've explained it. The money went to the drainage." "Then show me the drainage." Nathaniel rose. "Show me the contractor's bill. Show me the men who dug it. Show me one shovelful of that money in the ground. Margaret, and I'll beg your pardon." On my knees, and ride to the Monroe farm tonight and tell my wife she's a liar, and I hope she never forgives me for believing her. Show me, that's all. Show me the drainage that a river of money paid for, and I'll take it all back." The clock on the study mantel ticked 6 times before Margaret Caldwell spoke, and when she did, her voice had changed. The warmth was gone from it. What was left was cold and clear, and for the first time honest. "You ungrateful boy." Nathaniel went still. "I ran this family for 20 years, Margaret said. "I buried your mother and I raised you, and I kept this estate from the ruin your father would have made of it, with his soft heart and his loose hands, and I did it without one word of thanks, because that is what women do. We do the ugly arithmetic that keeps the roof up while the men go off to be admired in Norfolk. And now a girl you married for her father's water rights sits in a farmhouse 8 miles off, and on the strength of a note she planted under a breakfast ring, you'd take her side against mine. So it's true." Nathaniel's face had gone gray. "You're not even denying it now." "I'm not denying that I kept this family solvent by whatever means the year required," Margaret said. "The war ended Nathaniel. The shipyard money dried up. Your Norfolk ventures bled us for 3 straight years, and you never once looked at a book to see it, because you trusted me to make the numbers come right, and I made them come right. There are things a family does to survive that are best kept from the tender hearts at the table. I protected you from all of it, every year. You've never wanted for a thing, and you've never once asked how, and that was the arrangement, boy. That was always the arrangement. I keep the house standing, and you keep your clean hands and your good name and your peace of mind." "And Eleanor," his voice was barely a whisper. "Where was she in this arrangement? You forged her name. You wrote on the back of her letter that you'd hang the theft on her if it ever came out. I read it, Margaret, in your hand. If pressed, the forged sale is her doing. You were going to let my wife take the fall for money you spent." For the first time, something flickered in Margaret's face. Not remorse. Calculation, recalibrating the click of a mind that has just felt the ground shift and is testing for new footing. "Where is that letter now?" "Somewhere you'll never reach it." "Nathaniel, you were going to let her hang." He said it as if the shape of the words was new to his mouth. "My wife, a woman who lived under this roof 4 years, who wrote me 11 letters you stole off the tray, who tried to warn me you were robbing us, and got her own name forged in the ledger for her trouble. You were going to stand up in front of a court and swear she was the thief. Weren't you? That was the plan all along. That's what the forged signature was for. Not to steal. Any thief can steal. It was to have a neck ready to fit the noose the day someone finally counted." "Don't be dramatic," Margaret said, but her hand had found the back of the chair, the same tell she'd shown at the breakfast table, and Nathaniel saw it now because Eleanor had taught him without a word how to look. It never came to that. It was insurance, nothing more. A prudent woman keeps insurance. Insurance. He laughed, and it was an awful sound. "You call my wife's life insurance. I call an idle girl's reputation a small price against this family's ruin." "Yes." And there it was, at last, the whole of Margaret Caldwell laid bare, no warmth left to hide it. "You want to know the truth of it, Nathaniel, since you've decided you're grown enough for the truth." "Yes. I took the timber money. Yes, I've been taking money for years because someone had to hold this place together, and it was never going to be you. And yes, I signed her name and not yours, because your name is the family's name, and I'll not foul it, and her name is... Nobody's a bought bride from a mortgaged farm. No people left to raise a fuss. No fortune of her own, the perfect quiet girl to carry a sin she never committed if the day ever came. She was made for it. That's the only use she ever had. And you'd throw over the woman who saved this family 100 times for the one girl in it who was finally good for something." The study was silent. Nathaniel Carter looked at his aunt, the woman who had raised him, whose hands had bound his childhood cuts, and whose voice had read him to sleep, and whose judgment he had leaned on his whole life, like a man leans on a wall, and he saw her for the first time all the way through. "Get out of my house," he said. Margaret's chin lifted. "You need me. You don't even know where the money is. You don't know which contracts are real and which are air, which debts are owed and which are invented. Turn me out, and this estate comes down around your ears inside a year, and then where's your fine, loyal wife when there's no Carter Hollow left for her to be mistress of?" "I'll learn it," Nathaniel said. "I'll learn every rotten line of it if it takes me till Christmas. And I'll do it with lawyers, and I'll do it with the judge, and if there's a crime in these books, Margaret, and we both know there is, I'll not shield you from it. You raised me. I'll not forget that, and God help me, I'll grieve you the rest of my life. But you were going to let my wife hang, and there is no raising, no reading me to sleep, no 20 years of keeping the roof up that buys that back. Get out of my house, tonight, before I stop being the boy you raised and start being the man she needed." For a long moment, Margaret Caldwell stood her ground, measuring him, looking for the crack she'd always found before the soft place where he'd fold and let her manage it. She did not find it. Something had closed in her nephew's face that had never been closed to her before, and she understood with the cold clarity that had made her formidable her whole life, that the girl had done in one breakfast what she'd have sworn no soul could do. She'd shut Margaret Caldwell out of the last room in the world where she'd always had a key. "You'll regret this," Margaret said quietly, "when it all comes down. When the county learns the Carter books are a fraud and the money's gone, and your name's in the paper beside the word ruin, you'll wish you'd let me manage it the way I always managed it." "Maybe I will," Nathaniel said, "but I'll be able to look at her when I do." Margaret left the study. She left it with her back straight and her head high exactly as she'd left the breakfast room that morning, because she had learned long ago that the way you leave a room decides how people remember it. But this time, there was no one watching to be fooled, and the straightness of her back was only for herself, and it did not fool the one man left in the house at all. Nathaniel sat back down among his ledgers, and for a long time he did not move. He had lost in the space of a single day his aunt, his certainty, and the whole shape of the life he'd believed he was living, and none of it. Not one splinter of it hurt the way the smallest thing hurt the memory of his own voice that morning, saying, "You never wrote me any letters," saying it to her face in front of the judge, calling her a liar for the truest thing she'd ever done. He got up. He found the housekeeper. "Send for Micah. I want a horse saddled." "It's near dark, Mr. Carter. Where would you be riding at this hour?" "The Monroe farm." But it was the housekeeper, an old woman named Dell, who had served the Carters since before Nathaniel was born, who surprised him. She did not move to obey. She stood in the study doorway with her hands folded in her apron, and she looked at him with something he had never once seen on her face, reproach. "You'll not ride out of there tonight?" Dell said. "I beg your pardon. You'll not go to that girl tonight with an apology, sir, and I'll say why, and you can dismiss me for it after if you like. I'm old enough to speak plain at last." Dell's chin trembled, but her voice held. "That woman lived in this house 4 years, and I watched her, Mr. Carter. I watched her grow quieter every season like a lamp somebody was turning down. I watched her carry the letters to that tray with hope in her hands, and I watched her stop this past winter. Watched the day she stopped, when she set the last one down, and didn't look back to see, was it taken? And I said nothing. God forgive me, because it wasn't my place, and Mrs. Caldwell held my wages. So don't you go out there tonight to feel better. She doesn't owe you the mercy of taking your apology while it's fresh and easy. You let her have the peace of that farmhouse tonight. You've had 4 years of peace at her expense. You can spare her one night." Nathaniel Carter stood in his study and was rebuked by his housekeeper, and he took it because every word was true. "You're right," he said at last, and his voice was not steady. "You're right, Dell. I'll not go tonight." He sat down heavily. "But tell me, you watched all of it. Was there ever one day she seemed happy in this house?" Dell considered it honestly because he'd asked honestly. "The first month," she said, "before she learned. She came here thinking she'd be a partner in a great house. She had plans, sir. She used to walk the south fields of a morning and come back full of ideas about the orchard, the crop rotation, the drainage." Nathaniel flinched at the word, and she'd bring them to the table and they'd fall on the cloth like dropped plates, Because you'd your letters, and Mrs. Caldwell had her ways, and after a while, a body stops bringing ideas to a table where they only break. The happy went out of her by the first frost. I could near about mark the day. The drainage, Nathaniel repeated numbly. She had ideas about the drainage. Real ones, good ones. She'd have dug it herself if you'd let her hold a shovel. And Nathaniel Carter put his face in his hands, because his aunt had stolen a fortune under the name of drainage that was never dug, and his wife had begged 4 years running to be allowed to dig it, and he had heard neither of them, and the whole ruinous joke of his life sat before him plain as a ledger line. He did not ride out of that night, but he did not sleep either. He sat up with the books, and he began clumsily, ignorantly, a grown man learning his own affairs for the first time, like a schoolboy at his sums, to trace the money. He found the phantom wages Eleanor had spotted 2 years before. He found 3 contracts for work that no man in the county could remember being done. He found, worst of all, a pattern so patient and so long-running that he understood the timber theft was not the beginning of it, but merely the largest single stone in a wall Margaret had been building brick by brick since before Eleanor ever came, and that his wife in 2 years of quiet had uncovered more of it alone, and frightened than he had managed to see in 14 years of trust. Toward dawn he came to the last thing. It was a small book, not a ledger hidden, not cleverly, but simply tucked behind the estate accounts, where a man who never opened the accounts would never find it. Margaret had left it. In her certainty that he would never look, she had left it, and in her haste to leave the house, she had not thought to take it, and it was her own private reckoning, not for the estate, but for herself. A list of moneys moved. Accounts in Richmond under names that were not hers. And on the last used page, dated only weeks before, a line that stopped Nathaniel's heart in his chest. He read it 3 times to be sure. Then he closed the little book, and he sat very still in the gray dawn light, and he understood that the thing coming for his family was far larger than a theft, and that Eleanor, wherever she was sleeping in that farmhouse 8 miles off, free of him at last, did not yet know the half of what she'd walked out of or what was still to come. He rose. He put the little book inside his coat against his chest where no one would find it and no one would take it. He went to the window and watched the sun come up over the south fields, the fields where a girl had once walked full of plans about an orchard, and he made himself a promise. The first honest promise he'd made in 4 years, and he made it not to the empty room and not to God, but to a woman who wasn't there to hear it, and had no reason left to believe him if she were. "I'll set it right," Nathaniel Carter said aloud to no one. "Whatever it costs, whatever's in this book, I'll set it right, and I'll not ask her to come back until it's done, and maybe not even then, but I'll set it right." 8 miles off, Eleanor Carter woke in a strange bed in her friend's spare room, and for one moment, in the soft confusion between sleep and waking, she reached for a ring that was not on her hand. Her fingers closed on empty air, and she remembered, and she lay still, and she waited to feel the grief of it. The grief did not come. What came instead, rising slow and certain in the July dawn, was something she had not felt in 4 years, and had near about forgotten the name of. It took her a moment to place it lying there in the pale early light, with her hand held up empty before her face. It was relief, and underneath the relief, steadier and stranger, and entirely her own, was the first clean breath of a woman who has stopped waiting to be heard and has decided at last to be listened to, whether they like it or not. She got up. She dressed. She went down to the kitchen where Abigail was already at the stove, and she said before the coffee was even poured, "Abby, I'm not going to hide out here and wait to see what he does." Abigail turned. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to town." Eleanor's voice was calm and level and utterly without fear. "I'm going to see Judge Pruitt, not to beg and not to weep, to lay the whole of it in front of the law before she can, because she'll go to the law too. Abby, mark me, she'll get there first if she can, and paint it all her way. The mad wife, the forged sale, the abandoned husband. I know how she works. She'll try to be first." Eleanor took the cup Abigail handed her, and her hand was steady as stone. "So I'll be first." And in that moment, in that quiet farm kitchen, over a cup of morning coffee, with a fortune stolen, and a husband awake all night over the ruin of his family, and a cold woman riding somewhere between them toward the same courthouse. The true contest of it all began, not with a scream and not with a blow, but with a woman deciding at long last that she would speak and be heard, and let the whole county learn exactly what silence had been hiding in the grand house of Carter Hollow. The town of Ashby Court sat where two roads crossed, and the county's business got done. And by the time Eleanor Carter climbed down from Abigail's wagon in front of the courthouse, the story had gotten there before her. She felt it the moment her feet touched the boards of the walk. A woman she'd known 4 years, the milliner's wife, caught her eye across the street and looked away too fast. Two men outside the land office stopped talking as she passed. Somebody's servant sweeping a stoop went still with the broom in her hands to watch her go by. Eleanor kept her chin level and did not slow, but she felt every one of those looks land, and she knew what they meant. Because Margaret Caldwell had had 4 years to teach this county a particular version of the quiet wife at Carter Hollow. And the county was already fitting this morning's news into the shape Margaret had built for it. "They're looking at you like you did something," Abigail muttered close at her side. "They're looking at me like I'm about to," Eleanor said. "It's not the same thing, but it'll feel the same walking through it. Come on." Judge Pruitt's chambers were up a flight of stairs off the courthouse hall, and the clerk who met them at the top had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Mrs. Carter, the judge he's occupied at present, if you'd care to wait." "Occupied with whom?" The clerk's eyes flicked toward the closed door, and that flick told Eleanor everything. "She's already here," Eleanor said quietly. "Isn't she?" "Mrs. Caldwell arrived an hour past, ma'am. Asked to see the judge on a private matter." Abigail's breath hissed between her teeth. "She beat us." But Eleanor did not move toward the door, and did not raise her voice. She had spent 4 years learning what haste cost a woman in a room full of people waiting for her to be difficult, and she was not about to spend that lesson now. "Then we'll wait," she said, and she sat down on the hard bench outside the chambers, with her back straight and her hands folded exactly as she'd sat at the breakfast table, and she waited where the clerk could see her being calm. Behind the closed door, Margaret Caldwell was not being calm, though she wore calm like a good coat. "I came to you first, Judge Pruitt," she was saying, "because I've known you 30 years, and I'd not have this county's oldest family dragged through mud on the word of a distraught girl. What you witnessed at that breakfast table was the beginning of a breakdown I have watched coming for a year. The poor child cannot bear children. It's soured her mind. She's taken against me because I've had to be firm with her housekeeping, and now she's built a fantasy in which I've somehow robbed the very family that took her in. I tell you this in sorrow, not in anger." Pruitt sat behind his desk with his fingers laced over his considerable belly, and said nothing for a while. He was not a fast man, and he had never been a fast man, and 40 years on the bench had taught him that the quickest way to learn a thing was to let the person in front of you keep talking. "She said something about a ledger," he offered mildly. "At the breakfast, Cedar Ford, a timber sale. Invented or misread. She's had her hands in the household accounts and got some notion the estate ones don't balance to her satisfaction. She's no head for it, and estate is a complicated thing." Margaret leaned forward with exactly the right amount of confiding warmth. "I'll tell you what I fear, and I'd only say it to you. I fear she means to claim I've stolen, so that when the estate's true difficulties come to light, and they will, for Nathaniel's Norfolk ventures have gone badly, and the books are strained, she can lay the loss at my door and take herself off clean, perhaps with a settlement. It's a clever girl's play, Judge. Ruin the family's finances by mismanagement, or worse, then blame the aunt and walk away the wronged wife. I've seen her sort before. It was well done. It was very well done." And Judge Pruitt, who had indeed seen a great many things in 40 years, might well have found it plausible. A distraught young wife, a strained estate, an accusation conveniently aimed at the one person who could contradict her. If he had not, that very morning, watched Eleanor Carter set a ring on a breakfast cloth and say, calm as still water, "If the day comes that I am accused of being mad, of being difficult, I want it on the record of your memory that I told you the truth was going to be inconvenient for certain people, and that they knew it, and that they'd already begun." He had not forgotten it. He was too old and too careful to forget a thing like that. "She predicted you. he said. Margaret paused. I beg your pardon. The girl, this morning. Before she left the table, she looked me in the eye and told me that she'd shortly be called mad, difficult, and unfaithful, and that the people who'd call her so knew the truth and had already begun their work. Prewitt unlaced his fingers. And now here you sit, Mrs. Caldwell, not 4 hours later, calling her mad and difficult and hinting she means to abandon her husband for a settlement. You've matched her prophecy line for line. Now, I'll tell you honest, a woman who calls the shot before it's fired has either got the second sight or she knows the shooter's mind uncommon well, and I don't hold with the second sight. For the first time, Margaret's composure showed a hairline crack, not in her face, which stayed serene, but in the small silence, before she answered the beat too long. She's clever, I've said so. She anticipated I'd have to defend myself and dressed it up as prophecy to poison you against the truth. Maybe, Prewitt allowed. It's a fair point, and I'll weigh it. I'll weigh all of it. He stood, which for a man of his bulk was a slow and deliberate thing, and it signaled the meeting was ending on his terms and not hers. I'll tell you what I won't do, Mrs. Caldwell. I won't decide a matter of forgery and theft on a private conversation in my chambers with one party present and the other sitting on a bench in my own hall, for I've been told she's arrived, and don't trouble to look surprised. You knew she'd come. If there's a crime here, it'll be aired proper with both parties and their proofs, and I'll look at every ledger and every letter myself. That's the law. I'll not bend it for the oldest family in the county, nor break it for the newest wife in it. Margaret rose too and gathered herself, and knew better than to press. Of course. I only wish to spare everyone the ugliness. Ugliness spared is generally ugliness hidden, Prewitt said. In my experience. Good day. She swept out, and there on the bench sat Eleanor Carter, straight-backed and calm, and looking directly at her. And for one instant in the courthouse hall with the clerk watching, and Abigail Monroe half-risen with her fists balled, the two women's eyes met. Margaret recovered first. She always did. Eleanor, I'm glad you've come to your senses and sought the judge. He'll help you see how much of this is grief and how much is truth, and I'll not hold this morning against you when you're well again. Loud enough for the clerk to hear, warm enough to sound like mercy. Eleanor did not stand and did not raise her voice. You wrote on the back of my letter, Mrs. Caldwell. Margaret's smile did not move, but her step did the smallest hitch there and gone. If pressed, the forged sale is her doing. Eleanor quoted softly into the quiet hall, each word placed like a stone. She signed it, not I. You wrote that, in your own hand. On the back of a letter I wrote to my husband. And I have it, and the judge is going to read it, and there is not enough grief in the world to have made me write that about myself. For one long moment, the mask on Margaret Caldwell's face and the woman beneath it were not the same size, and everyone in the hall saw the gap. Then she closed it and turned and went down the stairs, and her back was very straight, and it fooled no one now. Prewitt had come to his chamber door at the sound of voices. He looked at Eleanor on the bench. He looked at the empty stairs where Margaret had gone. Mrs. Carter, he said, you'd best come in. And bring whatever it is you keep saying you have. She had it. She had all of it carried into town in a plain cloth-wrapped bundle she'd guarded on her lap, the whole 8 miles, the household books in her own clean hand, 4 years of them honest to the penny. The copy she'd made of the forged timber receipt, so the true E could be set beside the false one. And the letter, her November letter seal, broken her warning on the front, and Margaret's cold reminder to herself on the back, the two of them inseparable. My accusation and her confession sharing a single sheet of paper. Prewitt read for a long time. He read the way careful old men read silently, twice his finger moving under the lines. Eleanor sat and did not fill the silence because she had learned the power of it from the woman who'd stolen from her, and she'd be a poor student not to use it now. When Prewitt finally set the letter down, he did not speak right away. He took off his spectacles and pinched the bridge of his nose and looked for a moment very tired and very old. I've known that woman 30 years, he said at last. "I ate at her table. I stood up at her husband's funeral." He put his spectacles back on. "And this is her hand. I'd know it anywhere. I've had 100 letters from Margaret Caldwell over the years, and I could pick her writing out of a stack a mile high." He tapped the back of the letter. "This is her hand, Mrs. Carter, telling herself to blame you for a theft weeks before you ever set a ring on a breakfast table. There's no grief invented this. There's no clever wife scheme wrote this on the back of her own letter to frame herself. This is exactly what it looks to be." Eleanor let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for years. "But I'll tell you what troubles me," Prewitt went on, and his voice sharpened. "This letter proves she meant to blame you. It proves malice. But malice isn't theft. To prove she stole to bring a charge that'll stand, I need the money, Mrs. Carter. I need to show a court where it went. A forged signature and a spiteful note make her a liar and a schemer. They don't yet make her a thief in the eyes of the law. She'll stand up and say the sale was real, and the money went into the estate and your husband spent it, and now you're both trying to make her the goat for your ruin. And she'll say it well. You've seen how well she says things. Wimbo, I so be seen." "The money's in Richmond," Eleanor said. Prewitt looked up sharply. "You know that? I know she has means she oughtn't. I know there are letters in her lap desk from a Richmond house of business that a widow living on a nephew's charity has no cause to be writing." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "But I couldn't take those, Judge. I took my own letter back because it was mine. I'll not stand in front of you having stolen another woman's private correspondence, even hers, even to prove this, because the moment I do, I'm what she's spent 4 years telling everyone I am. I'll win with clean hands, or I'll lose the county's belief along with my case." And Judge Prewitt, 40 years on the bench, looked at the young woman across his desk with something that had grown over the course of the morning into plain respect. "That," he said, "is the most lawyerly thing I've heard said in this room in a decade, and it come out of a farmer's daughter with no ring on. You're right. Stolen proof is no proof. It'd sink you." He drummed his fingers. "The lawful way is the slow way. I can open an inquiry. I can summon the estate ledgers, all of them, under the court's authority, and I can send to Richmond for the records of any house of business she's dealt with, and if the money's there, we'll find it, and it'll stand up because we came by it honest. But it'll take weeks, and in those weeks, she'll not sit still. She'll move the money if she can, or move against you, or both. You understand that?" "I understand it better than anyone alive," Eleanor said. What none of them understood yet, not Eleanor, not the judge, not even Margaret Caldwell, riding cold and furious back toward a house that was no longer hers, was that the money had already begun to move, and it had not been Margaret who moved it. Because at that same hour, 8 miles off, Nathaniel Carter had ridden not to the Monroe farm, and not to the courthouse, but hard for Richmond, with the little private book buttoned inside his coat against his chest, and he had gone there to do the one thing that book had told him in a single line that he had to do before anyone else read it. The line had read, "Loan against Carter Hollow Ferris and Blount Richmond, 4,000, due Michaelmas collateral full title." Margaret had not only been stealing from the estate. In the last weeks, seeing the ground shift, feeling Eleanor's quiet watching turned to something sharper. She had borrowed $4,000 against Carter Hollow itself, against the land, the house, the whole of it, from a Richmond lending house, using authority she'd forged in Nathaniel's name, the same way she'd forged Eleanor's in the ledger. She had meant it as her escape. If the theft came out, she'd have $4,000 in hand, and a nephew drowning in a debt he never knew he owed, and she'd be gone to some city where a woman of means asks no one's leave. The forged signature on the loan was the last brick in her wall, and the loan came due at Michaelmas weeks away, and if it went unpaid, the Richmond house could take the title, and Carter Hollow would pass out of the family forever, and Eleanor's whole hard-won proof would be a victory over a ruin. Nathaniel reached Ferris and Blount 2 hours before they closed their doors for the day. "I've come about a loan taken against Carter Hollow Estate," he told the clerk. $4,000 due Michaelmas. My name is Nathaniel Carter. I own that land." The clerk, a narrow man named Blount, who was one of the 2 names over the door, looked at him carefully. Mr. Carter, we've had dealings with your house this past month, though not with you directly. The papers were brought by your representative, a Mrs. Caldwell acting on your written authority. Show me the authority. Blount hesitated, then went and got it, because a man who owns land and asks to see a paper signed in his name has a right to see it. He laid it on the counter, and Nathaniel Carter looked down at his own signature. Nathaniel Carter, written in a hand that was not his careful patient, almost right and wrong, in exactly the small way he'd learned that morning to see, because Margaret had studied his hand as she'd studied Eleanor's, and had gotten it almost, but a man knows his own name, the way he knows his own face, and this was not it. That's not my hand, Nathaniel said quietly. Blount went very still. Sir, that authority is forged, Mr. Blount. I never wrote it. I never authorized any loan against my land. The first I heard of it was this morning. Nathaniel set both hands flat on the counter to keep them steady. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking here's a man come to wriggle out of a debt by crying forgery. So I'll tell you what I've come to do, and you'll see I'm not that man. I've not come to repudiate the debt. I've come to pay it. Blount blinked. To pay it. All of it. Now. Every dollar. Today or by tomorrow when I can move the funds. Because I'll not have this house able to take 1 acre of Carter Hollow on the strength of a forgery, and I'll not have that debt hanging over my land while the law does its slow work at home. Nathaniel's voice was low and hard. I'll pay the $4,000, and in exchange I'll have from you a full and honest paper stating what was borrowed, when, and on whose signature. And I'll have you or your partner ready to swear before a judge in Ashby Court that the authority that woman brought you was in the name of Nathaniel Carter, and that Nathaniel Carter now stands before you saying he never wrote it. Will you do that? Blount studied him a long moment, this wealthy, disheveled, hollow-eyed man who'd ridden in from the county to pay a debt he could have disowned in order to hang the theft on the very person who'd brought them the business. It was not the behavior of a swindler. Swindlers did not pay. I'll do it, Blount said slowly. God help me if that paper's forged. We'd have been left holding worthless collateral when it all came out anyhow. You're paying us out of a hole we didn't know we were in, Mr. Carter, and telling us the truth of it besides. That's more than the woman did. He drew the loan papers toward him. I'll write you your honest paper, and I'll come to Ashby Court myself and swear to it if it comes to that. It's a poor month for our house, Mr. Carter, and we're glad of the $4,000. But a lending house lives on knowing whose name is real. And if we let a forged authority stand once we're finished, I'll swear to it gladly. And so it was that by the time Eleanor Carter climbed back into Abigail's wagon outside the courthouse, her clean proof laid before a judge who believed her. The man she'd left had already ridden 30 miles and spent $4,000 and secured the one witness that could turn Margaret's malice into a hanging matter, and neither husband nor wife knew the other had spent the day fighting the same fight from opposite ends of it. Eleanor learned it 2 days later, and she did not learn it gently. She was at the Monroe farm at the kitchen table where she'd taken to doing Abigail's accounts to earn her keep when a rider came up the lane. It was not Nathaniel. It was Dell, the old housekeeper, come in a hired trap with her Sunday bonnet on, and her face set like a woman who has made up her mind to do a hard thing. Mrs. Carter. Dell climbed down stiff-jointed. I'll not stay. I've no business being here, and if Mrs. Caldwell knew... She stopped. But Mrs. Caldwell's gone off to Richmond herself these 2 days, and I reckoned it was my one chance to come, and there's a thing you ought to know that nobody's going to tell you because the men are all too busy being brave to think a wife might want to know her husband's about to lose the house over her head. Eleanor stood slowly. What house? What are you saying, Dell? And Dell told her. All of it. The little private book Nathaniel had found. The loan against Carter Hollow. The forged authority in his own name. The $4,000. The 30-mile ride to Richmond to pay a debt he could have denied. The witness he'd secured. She told it plain and quick in the farm kitchen, and Eleanor Carter listened with her hand pressed slowly to her mouth. And when Dell was done, there was a long silence. He paid it, Eleanor finally said. He rode to Richmond and paid $4,000 against a debt he could have disowned, to prove she forged it, to protect the land. He did. He could have let it fall on her. It'd have been simpler. The debt was in his forged name. He could have cried forgery, refused it, let the Richmond house go after her for the fraud, and washed his hands clean and cheap. Eleanor's voice was strange, unsteady. Instead, he spent $4,000 of his own to keep the house whole and make himself the wronged party who paid rather than the ruined man who welched. That's Dell. That's the first time in 4 years I've known him to think 3 moves ahead of his own comfort. "That's what I come to tell you," Dell said quietly. "I'll say no more than that, for it's not my place to tell you what to feel. But you set a ring on a table and asked a man to open his eyes, and Mrs. Carter, for whatever it's worth from an old woman who watched you get quiet by the frost, his eyes are open. I never thought I'd live to see it. He's up half of every night with the books learning his own affairs, like a boy at school. And he'll not send for you. He told Micah so. Said he'd not ask you back till it was set right, and maybe not then. So he'll not tell you himself. That's why I come. Because a woman's owed the truth of her own situation, whether the men think to give it her or not." And with that, Dell climbed back into her hired trap, refusing even a cup of water, and drove off down the lane. And Eleanor Carter stood in the yard, a long time with her arms wrapped around herself, in the summer heat, feeling the whole hard shape of the thing she'd built begin to shift under her, because she had walked out of Carter Hollow, certain of exactly one thing, that the man she left would never change. And now that certainty had a crack in it, and she did not know yet whether the crack was a mercy or a fresh danger. She did not have long to wonder. Because Margaret Caldwell in Richmond had gone to Ferris and Blount to draw against the very loan she'd forged, only to be told by a suddenly cold and careful Mr. Blount that the loan was paid in full, the collateral released, and that Mr. Nathaniel Carter had been in personally to settle it and to have some words about the authority under which it was taken. And Margaret Caldwell, who had planned her whole escape around $4,000, understood in one terrible instant that the ground she'd been standing on had been paid out from under her, that her nephew was not drowning helplessly at home, but moving against her with a speed she'd never credited him with, and that the quiet girl's ring on the breakfast table had not been the end of Margaret's scheme, but the first stone of an avalanche now coming down on her from 3 directions at once. She did the only thing left to a cornered woman with a cold, clear head. She stopped trying to escape, and she decided to fight. She came back from Richmond, and she did not slink, and she did not hide. She came back into Ashby Court on a market day when the whole county was in town, and she went from acquaintance to acquaintance, with tears in her eyes and grief in her voice, and she told a story, a good story, a story, built brick by brick on facts twisted just enough. That her nephew had gone mad with a young wife's poison in his ear. That he'd ridden to Richmond and thrown away $4,000 the family couldn't spare on some fever about a loan, and now meant to blame his loyal aunt for his own ruin. That the wife had abandoned him, and now seeing the estate might yet be saved, was crawling back through the courts to claim it. That Margaret, poor Margaret, who'd given 20 years to that family, was to be the sacrifice. And the county, which loves nothing so much as a fallen great house and a scheming young wife, began some of it to listen. Because Margaret Caldwell had spent 30 years building the credit of her good name, and Eleanor Carter had spent 4 years being taught by that same woman to seem strange and quiet and difficult, and when the 2 stories met in the market square, they did not meet as equals. Eleanor felt the county turn. She felt it the next time she came to town, felt the looks go colder, heard a word or two, not quite hidden. Poison. Abandoned him. After the money now. Margaret had done in 3 market days what she'd spent 4 years preparing to do. She'd made the truth sound like the scheme, and the scheme sound like the truth. And she'd done it out loud in public where a judge's private belief could not reach. "She's winning them," Abigail said grimly, driving them home. "The judge believes you, but the judge is one man. She's out there working the whole county like dough, and folks would rather believe the scheming wife than admit they can't tell a thief from a saint after 30 years of her Sunday smiles." "Then the judge and his slow, lawful way won't be enough," Eleanor said. She was quiet a long moment, watching the road. She's made this a matter of who the county believes, not who the ledgers convict. She's moved it out of the courthouse and into the square because she knows she loses in the courthouse and she thinks she wins in the square. Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. So I'll have to win it in the square too, in front of all of them. Not with the judge deciding quiet in his chambers weeks from now. By then she'll have poisoned every well in the county, but out loud in the open, where every soul who's whispered poison has to stand and watch the truth come out. Abigail glanced at her alarmed. Eleanor, that's a fearful risk. You put it all in front of the whole county, and she twists one thing, plants one doubt. She will twist things. She'll be brilliant. Eleanor's jaw set. But she can't twist her own hand on the back of my letter, Abby. She can't twist a witness ridden in from Richmond swearing she forged Nathaniel's name. She can't twist a forged E she never bothered to learn. Every proof I have is a thing she made and can't unmake. So let her have the county's ear. Let her fill the square with her grief and her lies. I'll bring the proofs she can't touch, and I'll set them down one at a time in front of all of them, and I'll let them watch her try to twist a signature into the shape of innocence. She turned to her friend, and her eyes were bright and hard and entirely unafraid. She built her whole life on the way she leaves a room. I'm going to make her stand in a room she can't leave until the truth is done being told. The chance came sooner than either of them expected, and it did not come the way they'd planned. It came because Margaret Caldwell, growing bold on the county's turning sympathy, made one move too many. She went to Judge Pruitt publicly this time on the courthouse steps on a crowded day, and she demanded loudly, tearfully, that the judge do his duty and take up the matter of the ruined Carter estate and name the guilty party and clear the good name of a wronged old woman being slandered by a mad wife and a nephew gone soft in the head. She demanded it in front of 40 people. She demanded a hearing. She thought she was forcing the judge's hand toward her story in the square where she was winning. She had just handed Eleanor Carter the one thing she needed a public reckoning called for out loud, in front of witnesses by Margaret's own mouth, on a day the whole county was watching. Judge Pruitt looked down at Margaret Caldwell from the top of the courthouse steps, and he looked out at the 40 faces gathered to watch, and he was old and slow and careful. And he had been waiting without letting her see it for exactly this. "You want a hearing, Mrs. Caldwell?" he said loud enough to Carrie. "You've asked for one public before God and this county, and I'll not deny a citizen her call for the law to do its work. So you shall have it. 3 days hence in the courthouse, and it'll be open, and every soul who's got a proof to bring or a truth to swear will bring it, and swear it under my eye." He let his gaze move across the crowd, and it settled at the back on a wagon that had just pulled up, on the woman climbing down from it with a plain cloth bundle held against her chest. "And that includes you, Mrs. Carter, since I see you've come to town. You've said all along you wanted your say in front of witnesses who couldn't be paid to remember it wrong. 3 days. You'll have the largest set of witnesses this county can hold." The whole square turned to look at Eleanor Carter. She stood by the wagon with the county's cold eyes on her, and Margaret's triumph curdling 20 feet away, and 3 days between her and the moment she'd been building toward for 2 long, frightened, silent years. And she did not flinch, and she did not look away, and she did not clutch the bundle any tighter than she already held it. "I'll be here, Judge Pruitt," Eleanor said, and her voice carried clear across the square, calm as still water, the voice of a woman who had stopped being afraid a long while ago. "I've waited 4 years to be heard. I reckon I can wait 3 more days." 3 days is a long time in a county that has decided to talk, and Margaret Caldwell used every hour of it. She did not sit idle waiting for the hearing. She went quiet and grieving from parlor to parlor, and where she could not get a parlor, she got a porch, and where she could not get a porch, she got a word on the street. And everywhere she went, she wept the exact right amount and said the exact right thing. She never called Eleanor a thief outright. That was Margaret's art. She never said the ugly thing plain. She let you arrive at it yourself, so you'd think it your own idea. She only said, in sorrow, that she feared for the poor girl's mind. She only wondered aloud how a family so blessed had come to this. She only mentioned as if it pained her that $4,000 had gone to Richmond on some fever of the nephew's, and wasn't it a shame? And wherever would it end? And the county? God help it drank it down. Because Margaret Caldwell had 30 years of Sunday smiles in the bank, and Eleanor Carter had 4 years of being taught to seem strange, and it is easier to believe a familiar woman's tears than a quiet one's ledger. Eleanor felt it thicken around her every time she came to town. The second day before the hearing, she went to buy thread at the milliner's and the milliner's wife. The same woman who'd looked away that first morning served her with her mouth pressed thin and gave her wrong change and did not correct it when Eleanor pointed it out. Only stared as if to say, "You'll take what you're given and be glad of it, you who ruined the finest family in the county." Eleanor took the wrong change and said thank you and walked out with her back straight and got as far as the wagon before her hands started to shake. "They've made up their minds," she said to Abigail low. "Half of them. More than half. She's been 3 days ahead of me the whole way, and I've been sitting at your kitchen table doing sums like a fool." "You've been getting your proofs in order, which is what wins the hearing," Abigail said stoutly, but there was worry under it. "The judge believes you. That's what matters. The judge is one man in a county of 1,000, and the judge can rule me innocent, and the county can still call me guilty for the rest of my life." Eleanor climbed up into the seat. "That's what she understands that I was slow to. There's the law's verdict, and there's the county's verdict, and a woman has to win both or she's won nothing. She can lose in that courthouse and still ruin me in every parlor for 40 years. So I can't just be found innocent, Abby. I have to be believed, in front of all of them. Or I've traded 4 years of silence for a lifetime of being the wife who ruined the Carters." It was that night, the night before the hearing, that Nathaniel Carter finally came. He came alone on horseback up the Monroe Lane in the last of the light, and Eleanor was on the porch when she heard the hoofbeats, and she knew him by his seat in the saddle before she could see his face, and something turned over in her chest that she did not have a name for and did not much want one. He dismounted at the gate. He did not come through it. He stood on the far side of the fence with his hat in his hands, and that alone told her something. Nathaniel Carter, who had never in 4 years waited on the far side of anything, standing at a fence with his hat in his hands, like a man who knew he had no right to come nearer without leave. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, for Abigail had come to the door, "I'd ask your pardon for coming to your house uninvited, and I'd ask a word with my wife if she'll give it, on the porch where you can both see me. I'll not come in, and I'll not come through the gate unless she says." Abigail looked at Eleanor. Eleanor was quiet a moment. Then she said, "It's all right, Abby. Leave the door open." Abigail went inside, but did not go far, and Eleanor came down the porch steps into the yard and stopped, and the two of them stood with the fence between them in the failing light. "I'll say it quick," Nathaniel said, "because you've a hearing tomorrow, and you need your rest, and because if I take too long, I'll lose my nerve, and I've spent 4 years being a coward in ways I'm only now learning the size of, so I'll not add another." He turned his hat in his hands. "I know about the hearing. I know she's turned the county. I know you're walking into that courthouse tomorrow with half the parish already calling you a schemer, and I know it's my aunt's doing, and I know," his voice caught, "I know it's my doing too, 4 years of my doing. She could only paint you strange because I let you grow strange and quiet at my own table and never once asked why. So I'll not stand here and tell you I've come to save you, Eleanor. You don't need saving, and you'd not thank me for the offer, and you'd be right not to." Eleanor said nothing. She had learned the power of it from the best. "I've come to tell you what I can bring tomorrow," Nathaniel went on, "so you can decide whether you want it. I found her private book. There's a loan in it, 4,000 against Carter Hollow in my name forged, taken to a Richmond house. I rode there. I paid it off, and I got the lender, a Mr. Blount, to swear the authority she brought him was forged, that I never signed it. He's here, Eleanor, in Ashby Court tonight. He rode down himself to testify, because a lending house lives or dies on knowing whose name is real, and he'll not have it said that Ferris and Blount took a forged authority and stayed quiet. He'll stand up tomorrow and swear it." He drew a breath. "That's a second forgery in my hand this time to set beside the one in yours. She forged you in the ledger, and she forged me on the loan, and the same patient, almost right hand, did both. Anne Blount will swear to his, and you can swear to yours. And there's not a soul in that courtroom will be able to say two different people learned to forge two different signatures by accident. Eleanor's breath had gone shallow. You'd stand up, in front of the whole county, and swear your own aunt forged your name. I'd stand up and swear the truth, Nathaniel said. Whatever it costs me. And it'll cost me plenty. Half that county's going to hate me for turning on the woman who raised me, and the other half's going to pity me for a fool who couldn't see his own books. And I've earned both, and I'll take both. He looked at her steadily now, and his hat had gone still in his hands. But I'll not do it without your leave, Eleanor. This is your hearing. You built it. You carried the proof 8 miles on your lap, and you kept your hands clean when you could have stolen more, and Prewitt told me himself it was the most lawyerly thing he'd seen in 10 years. It's yours. I'll not come marching in to be your rescuer and take the morning off you after you did all the bleeding. If you want me there, I'll be there, and I'll bring Blount, and I'll swear till I'm hoarse. And if you'd rather do it without me, if you'd rather the county see you win it on your own and not have it muddied by a husband's late heroics, then I'll stay home and I'll send you Blount and the forged loan by messenger, and you can use them how you see fit, and I'll never say a word of complaint. Your choice, not mine. I've made enough of your choices for you. And there it was. The thing Eleanor Carter had left a ring on a breakfast table to ask for, given back to her at a fence in the dark, not as a grand gesture, but as a plain question. What do you want, and how shall I do it? 4 years she'd have traded her right hand for that question. And now it was here, and it was almost harder to bear than the silence had been, because the silence she'd understood, and this she did not. Why? She said finally. Her voice was not quite steady. Why pay the $4,000? You could have disowned it. Cried forgery, refused the debt, let the Richmond house go after her. Cheaper, cleaner. You'd have kept your money and still hung her for the fraud. I thought about it, Nathaniel admitted. On the road there, I'll be honest, I thought hard about it. $4,000 is $4,000. He turned the hat once. But if I'd refused the debt, the Richmond house takes the collateral to cover their loss, and the collateral was the whole title. The house, the land, everything. Refuse the debt and I might have hung Margaret and lost Carter Hollow doing it, and then what would you have won, Eleanor? A verdict over a ruin. Justice with no roof on it. You'd have proved yourself innocent of stealing a house that was already gone. He shook his head. You didn't leave that ring to burn the place down. You left it to be heard, to have the truth stand. And truth's a poor comfort if it stands in a field where the house used to be. So I paid, to keep the thing whole. So that when you win, and you're going to win, Eleanor, there's still something left standing for the winning to matter. Eleanor Carter stood in the dark yard and looked at her husband across a fence, and could not for a long moment say anything at all, because he had just told her in plain words that he'd spent $4,000 not to save himself and not even to catch Margaret, but to make sure that her victory would have somewhere to land. And that was so exactly the opposite of 4 years of a man who'd never once thought of where her ideas might land, that she hardly knew how to hold it. Bring Blount, she said at last. Her voice was rough. Bring the forged loan. And come yourself, Nathaniel. Stand up and swear it, not to rescue me, to stand beside the truth, where the whole county can see a Carter man choose it over his own blood. That's worth more than any proof I can carry. Not because I need saving, because they need to see it. They need to see a powerful man in this county choose the truth when it costs him everything, so that the next quiet wife who tries to be heard has one example to point to. She swallowed. Come. But understand me plain, coming tomorrow doesn't buy you back into that house. It doesn't buy you a ring on my finger. It buys you nothing but the right to have done the right thing. If that's enough for you, come. It's enough, Nathaniel said quietly. It was always going to have to be enough. I stopped expecting to be bought back the night I read your November letter and understood I'd called you a liar for the truest thing you ever wrote. I don't come to be forgiven, Eleanor. I come because it's right, and because you asked, and those are the only 2 reasons a man should ever need, and I spent 4 years needing worse ones. I'll be there at dawn. He put his hat on. He did not reach across the fence. He mounted his horse and he paused, and he said one more thing into the dark. They had ideas about the orchard once, he said. Dell told me that you used to walk the south fields full of plans, the drainage, the crop rotation, and bring them to the table and watch them break on the cloth. I've been walking those fields myself of a morning since you left, trying to see what you saw. A pause. I can't see it yet. I'm not clever the way you're clever, but I've stopped letting the ground go to waste while I wait to be admired somewhere else. That's the smallest start there is. I know it, but it's a true one. And he turned the horse and rode off down the lane into the dark. And Eleanor Carter stood at the fence a long time after the hoofbeats had faded. Well, said Abigail from the doorway softly. I'll be. Don't, Eleanor said, not turning around. Don't, Abby. It's one fence and one speech. 4 years of fog doesn't lift on one speech. No, Abigail agreed. But the sun's got to come up somewhere first, and it generally comes up small. The morning of the hearing, Ashby Court had never been so full. They came from every corner of the county, because a fallen great house is the finest entertainment a rural county knows, and because Margaret had spent 3 days promising them a spectacle of a mad wife brought to justice, and they came to see it. The courtroom filled, and then overfilled men standing along the walls, women crowded on the benches, and when there was no more room inside, they gathered in the hall, and on the steps, and in the square, so that word could be passed out to them in relays. Eleanor came in on Abigail's arm, with her plain cloth bundle held against her chest, and the room turned to look at her, and the looks were cold, and she walked through them to the front, and sat where the clerk directed her, and did not let one of them see her flinch. Margaret Caldwell was already there, in gray grave and dignified. A wronged old woman come to see justice done, and she had positioned herself beautifully, and half the room's sympathy sat with her before Prewitt ever took his chair. He took it slow. He always did. He looked out at the packed room and the cold faces and the 2 women at the front, and he let the silence stretch until it was his and not the crowd's. And then he spoke. This is not a trial, Prewitt said. Let's be clear on that from the first, because half of you came expecting one. There's no jury here and no verdict I'll hand down today. This is an inquiry called for. He looked at Margaret. Called for out loud in this square by Mrs. Caldwell herself, who demanded the law take up the matter of the Carter estate and name the guilty party. She'll have her wish. We're going to look at this matter in the open, with every party present and every proof on the table. Because Mrs. Caldwell wanted it public, and Mrs. Carter has said, from the first she wanted witnesses who couldn't be paid to remember it wrong. So you're the witnesses, all of you. Sit quiet and watch, and when it's done, you'll have seen what you came to see, though I'll wager it's not what you were promised. That last landed. A murmur moved through the room. Margaret's expression did not change, but Eleanor, watching, saw her hand find the arm of her chair. Prewitt called Margaret first. It was a shrewd thing he let her tell her story at full strength in front of the sympathetic room before he brought a single proof against it, because a story is never so vulnerable as right after it's been told most confidently, and Margaret told it beautifully. She wept at the right moments. She spoke of 20 years of service of a family she'd held together with her own 2 hands, of a nephew she'd raised from a motherless boy, of the grief of watching him poisoned against her by a girl who could not bear children and could not bear to be corrected in her housekeeping. She never once accused Eleanor of stealing. She only mourned out loud that the estate was strained and $4,000 gone to Richmond, and a good old woman set up to take the blame. She was so good that when she finished dabbing her eyes, the room's sympathy had thickened around her like a wall, and Eleanor heard behind her a woman whisper the poor soul, and another murmur agreement. Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell, Prewitt said, unmoved. That was well said. It was very well said. He let that sit a beat too long, so that the compliment turned faintly to something else. Now, you've spoken of $4,000 gone to Richmond. Let's talk about that money since you raised it. You've told this room it was the nephew's fever, a wild waste. I'd like to call the man who took that money in Richmond, Mr. Blount, if you'd stand. And Margaret Caldwell for the first time went still in a way the whole front of the room could see, because she had not known Blount was here. She had gone to Richmond and been told the loan was paid, and gone cold, with the knowledge that her nephew had moved against her. But she had not known that the lender himself had ridden down to Ashby Court, was sitting in this very room, was rising now to his feet at the back with his ledger under his arm. "Mr. Blount," Prewitt said, "you're a partner in the house of Ferris and Blount Richmond. You lend money against property. Tell this room about a loan taken against Carter Hollow." Blount was a dry, precise man, and he told it dry and precise, which was worse for Margaret than any passion would have been. He told of a Mrs. Caldwell coming to his house some weeks past, bearing a written authority in the name of Nathaniel Carter, borrowing $4,000 against the full title of the estate. He told of Nathaniel Carter arriving in person days later to declare that authority forged, that he'd signed no such thing, that the first he'd heard of the debt was that very week. He told of Nathaniel paying the whole $4,000 in full, rather than repudiate it and risk the lender seizing the land. "Now that's a peculiar thing, Judge," Blount said, "and I'll say it plain because it's the thing that convinced me. A man crying forgery to escape a debt is common as dirt. But this man cried forgery and paid the debt. Every dollar. He didn't come to wriggle out. He came to make certain no forged paper could ever take his land and to tell us the truth of who'd brought it at the cost of $4,000 of his own dollars. In 30 years of lending, I have never once seen a swindler pay. Swindlers don't pay. Only an honest man pays a debt he could lawfully deny. That's how I knew which one he was." The room had gone very quiet. The wall of sympathy around Margaret had developed a crack, and everyone could feel the draft through it. "And the authority," Prewitt said. "The paper she brought you signed Nathaniel Carter. Did you bring it?" "I did." Blount came forward and laid it on the table before the judge. "That's the authority, signed as you see Nathaniel Carter." "Mr. Carter," Prewitt said, "stand up. Is that your signature?" Nathaniel Carter rose. The whole room turned to look at him, the master of Carter Hollow, hollow-eyed and grim, about to swear against the woman who raised him in front of every soul who knew them both. He came forward. He looked at the paper a long moment. "No, sir," he said, and his voice carried to the back of the room. "That is not my hand. It's a good copy. It's a patient copy made by someone who studied my writing close over many years. But it's not mine. I've signed my name 10,000 times, and I know it the way I know my own face, and that's a stranger wearing my name. I never authorized that loan. I never signed that paper. The first I knew of it was the week I found it, and I paid it off rather than let a forgery cost my family its land. You understand," Prewitt said gravely, "what you're swearing. You're swearing your own aunt forged your name to steal against your estate." "I understand it," Nathaniel said. "God help me, I understand it better than I can say. That woman raised me. She bound my cuts and read me to sleep, and I trusted her judgment my whole life the way you trust the ground under your feet, and I'd give a great deal for this not to be true." His jaw worked. "But it is true, and I'll not lie to protect her because there's someone this lie was built to fall on, and she sat quiet in my house 4 years while it was built, and I'll not let it fall on her to spare myself the grief of my aunt's guilt. That's not a bargain I'm willing to make anymore. I made enough bad bargains with silence. This one I'll break in the open." And Eleanor Carter, sitting at the front with her bundle in her lap, felt the whole room's weight begin slowly to shift, felt it come off. Margaret's grief, and turned toward this grim, honest man, swearing against his own blood. And she understood that Nathaniel had just spent something in front of this county that no amount of money could buy back, and that he'd spent it exactly as he'd said he would not to rescue her, but because it was true. "Sit down, Mr. Carter," Prewitt said, not unkindly. "That was hard done, and honestly done, and this county won't soon forget it." He turned. "Now, Mrs. Carter, it's your turn. You've carried something into this room you've guarded a long while. Come and lay it down." Eleanor rose. She came forward with the cloth bundle, and she unwrapped it on the table with steady hands, and she did not weep, and she did not raise her voice, and she laid it out one piece at a time, and she made the whole room watch each piece land. "These are the household accounts," she said, setting down the 4 years of clean books. Every penny that came into that house and every penny that went out in my hand for 4 years. Any man here who reads figures may check them against each other and against the market records in this town, and he'll find them honest to the last cent. I put them first, Judge Pruitt, not because they prove the theft, but because before I say one word against anyone, I want this county to see what an honest ledger in my hand looks like, so that when they look at the next one, they'll know the difference. She set down the copy she'd made of the forged timber receipt, and beside it a dozen samples of her own true signature from the marriage Bible, from the account books, from old letters. This is a receipt from the estate ledger for a timber sale at Cedar Ford 1814, signed as you see Eleanor Carter, for a great sum of money I never made, never saw, and never signed for. She set her finger on it. Look at the E, then look at the E and every true signature of mine beside it. My E has a hook at the top here and here and here every time, for I've made it that way since I was a girl. The E on that receipt has no hook. Whoever forged my name studied my writing close, the same patient way they studied my husband's, and got it almost right, and missed the one thing they'd have had to love me to notice. Her voice did not shake, but something moved under it. That's how I always knew in the end who'd done it. She could copy my hand. She could not copy the parts of me she'd never once bothered to look at. The room was dead silent now. The crack in Margaret's wall had become a fissure, and then Eleanor laid down the last thing. This, she said, is a letter. I wrote it to my husband in November of last year. The 11th of 11 letters I wrote him over 4 years and set on the front hall tray, none of which he ever received because someone took them off that tray before they reached him. In this letter, I set down everything, the phantom wages, the timber theft, the forged signature, all of it, and I told him I was afraid to say it aloud because I feared what she'd do to me. I sealed it. I set it on the tray, and the next dawn I hid behind the hall curtain and watched who came for it, and I watched Margaret Caldwell take it and break the seal and read it and smile and put it in her pocket. A sound went through the room. I got it back, Eleanor said, weeks later from her own locked desk, and I'll tell this court plainly I took it because it was mine, my letter, my words, and I stole back nothing but what I wrote. And when I got it back, I found she'd written something on the reverse, in her own hand, a note to herself. She turned the letter over and held it up so the front of the room could see the writing on the back. It says, E. Suspects Cedar Ford. Watch her. If pressed, the forged sale is her doing. She signed it, not I. The room erupted not loudly, but in a low rolling murmur of 40 people, understanding the same terrible thing at once, and Pruitt let it run a moment before he lifted his hand. I've examined that letter, the judge said, and his voice cut the murmur off clean. I've had it 3 days. I've compared the writing on the reverse to a dozen letters I've had from Margaret Caldwell over 30 years, and I'll tell this county under my own authority as its judge, that is her hand. Beyond any doubt I can muster that is Margaret Caldwell's own writing telling herself weeks before Eleanor Carter ever set a ring on a breakfast table to blame the forged sale on the wife. Not the confusion of a grieving girl, not the scheme of a clever one. A thief's own private reminder to herself of whose neck she meant to fit the noose around when the day came. He set the letter down. So let's have it all in one place, Pruitt said. So this county that came for a spectacle can see plain what it's actually looking at. A signature forged in the wife's name in the estate ledger for money nobody can find in this estate. A second signature forged in the husband's name on a Richmond loan sworn to by the lender himself, who's no cause to lie and paid $4,000 to prove it. Both forgeries in the same patient practiced almost right hand. And a note in Margaret Caldwell's own writing planning to blame the first forgery on an innocent woman. Now. He looked out at the room. You came here promised a mad wife brought to justice. Look at what's on this table and tell me whose hand it points to. Every eye in that courtroom turned at last to Margaret Caldwell, and Margaret cornered exposed the wall of sympathy she'd built over 3 days, lying in rubble around her, did the only thing left to a woman with a cold, clear head and nothing left to lose. She stopped grieving. She stopped weeping. She rose to her feet, and the false softness fell off her like a dropped shawl, and the room saw for the first time the thing that had been underneath the Sunday smiles for 30 years. "Yes," Margaret Caldwell said, clear, cold, unashamed. "I took the money." The room went utterly silent. "I took it, and I'd take it again. And before you sit there gasping like landed fish, you might ask yourselves, who kept this family whole while you admired it? Not him." She jerked her chin at Nathaniel. Off in Norfolk playing merchant, bleeding this estate dry on ventures he never had the wit to work, and never once opening a book to see it. Somebody had to make the numbers come right. Somebody had to do the ugly arithmetic while the men got admired. I did it. 20 years I did it, and I kept the roof over all your grand opinions, and not one of you ever thanked me, because not one of you ever asked how it was done. Her eyes swept the room, and there was contempt in them now, plain and total. I signed her name because her name was worth nothing, a bought bride from a mortgaged farm with no people left to make a fuss. She was the safest place to set a loss. That's arithmetic, too. I'm not ashamed of arithmetic. "And the loan against the house," Prewitt said quietly. "$4,000 you meant to keep. My wage," Margaret said. 20 years unpaid. I was owed it, and I took it, and I'd have been gone clean with it if this ungrateful boy hadn't ridden to Richmond and thrown good money after it to make a martyr of himself. You want to call it theft? Call it theft. I call it the only honest accounting anyone in that family ever did. The woman who does the work taking the wage, the men were too busy being admired to pay her. It was in its cold and terrible way, almost magnificent. And it was also, Eleanor understood, watching her, the complete and final destruction of Margaret Caldwell. Because a room may pity a weeping old woman wronged, but it cannot pity a proud one who has just in open court confessed to forgery and theft, and the deliberate framing of an innocent wife, and called it arithmetic, and dared them all to object. The sympathy did not merely leave the room, it reversed. Eleanor felt it turn like a tide, felt every cold look that had followed her through that county for 3 days curdle into shame, and then swing hard the other way, toward the front bench, toward the quiet woman who'd sat 4 years in silence while this was built on her name. "Margaret Caldwell," Judge Prewitt said, and he rose to his full considerable height, and his voice filled the room. "I've known you 30 years, and I'll grieve the woman I thought you were the rest of my life. But you've stood in my court and confessed freely and proudly to forgery, to theft, and to the attempted framing of an innocent woman for your crimes. I'm binding you over. You'll be held to answer for it before the law, and this county has heard every word you've said, so there'll be no unsaying it in any parlor between here and Michaelmas." He nodded to the clerk. "Take her in charge." Margaret Caldwell was led from the courtroom, and she went the way she had always gone from every room, with her back straight and her head high. But this time, there was no one left to fool. And the straightness of her back was a thing everyone in that room now understood for exactly what it was. And it moved no one at all. And then it was done. And the room was left holding a truth entirely opposite to the one it had come for. And 40 people who had spent 3 days believing Eleanor Carter a schemer sat in the wreckage of that belief, not knowing where to put their eyes. Prewitt looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Carter, is there anything you wish to say to this county now it's all been heard?" Eleanor rose. She stood a moment, and she looked out at the faces that had been so cold to her, and Abigail watching, half expected, half hoped to see her friend make them pay for it, make them feel the smallness of what they'd done. She did not. "I've nothing to say against anyone in this room," Eleanor said quietly. "You believed a woman you'd known 30 years over a woman you'd known 4. I'd likely have done the same. I don't hold it against you, and I'll not spend the rest of my life reminding you of it. I only ever wanted one thing, and I've got it now, and it wasn't her ruin. I take no joy in it. She's an old woman, and she'll answer hard for what she did. And I find I can't be glad of that. All I ever wanted was to be heard, to sit in a room and say a true thing, and have it land instead of break on the cloth. That's all. 4 years I couldn't get it in my own house. Today I got it in front of the whole county." Her voice steadied. "So we're square, all of you. I asked to be heard and you've heard me. There's nothing owed either way. Let's none of us make more of it than that." And that plain, unbitter, unvengeful thing spoken by a woman who'd have had every right to salt the earth and chose not to, did more to win that county back than any triumph could have. You could feel it. A woman who does not gloat when she's earned the right to is a rarer and more unsettling sight than any weeping, and it left the room with no comfortable place to stand except at last on her side. Nathaniel had risen too, and he came toward her slow, uncertain hat in his hands again, and he stopped a few feet off, not presuming. "Eleanor," he said low just for her. "It's done. She's bound over. The land's clear, the debt's paid. Your name is cleared in front of everyone who ever whispered against it. There's not a soul in this county tomorrow will call you anything but wronged." He turned the hat. "I'll not ask you anything. I told you I wouldn't, and I meant it. But I wanted to say you did it. Not me, not Blount, not the judge. You. You carried it 8 miles on your lap, and you kept your hands clean, and you set it down one piece at a time, and you didn't gloat when you'd won, and I have never in my life seen anything done better or braver. And I got to watch the woman I was too blind to see for 4 years do it in front of the whole county. Whatever happens between us or doesn't, I'll be grateful the rest of my life that I got to watch it." Eleanor looked at him a long moment. "You stood up," she said, "in front of all of them, and swore against the woman who raised you, knowing it had cost you half this county's good opinion and the other half's respect." Her voice was uncertain in a way it had not been all day. "Why?" "Because it was true," Nathaniel said simply. "You taught me that, not with a lecture, with a ring on a breakfast table and a note underneath it. You showed me a person can set down everything comfortable and pick up the truth instead, and walk out the door with nothing but their own good name. And I watched you do it, and I thought—" His voice roughened. "I thought that's the bravest thing I've ever seen, and I've spent 4 years married to it and never looked up. So today, I looked up, and I did the true thing because you'd shown me how, and because it was the only apology worth making, not words, the thing itself." Eleanor Carter stood in the emptying courtroom, cleared, vindicated, heard at last by the whole county, with her honest ledgers and her forged receipt, and her terrible letter spread on the table before her, and her husband, standing a careful few feet off, with his hat in his hands, and no demand in him anywhere. And she found that the victory did not feel the way she'd thought it would all those nights planning it in the dark. It did not feel like an ending. It felt like a door standing open that she was not yet ready to walk through, and not yet ready to close. "I need time, Nathaniel," she said finally. "I've been heard today, and that's the thing I came for, and I'll not pretend it isn't everything I wanted. But being heard once in a courtroom and trusting a man in a house are 2 different roads, and I've walked the hard end of the second one 4 years, and it's left me careful." She wrapped the letters back in their cloth slowly. "Trust isn't a thing you can hand me across a courtroom because you did right by me once. It's a thing that gets built, day on day, small. And I don't know yet whether you've got the patience for the building because building's slow and quiet, and nobody admires you for it, and admiration was always the thing you couldn't live without." "Then let me learn the building," Nathaniel said. "Slow, small, no admiration in it. Let me learn it, and you watch, and you decide in your own time, and if the answer's no at the end of it, then it's no, and I'll have earned that too." He put his hat on. "I'll not send for you. I'll not press. You know where the house is, and you know it's yours, more yours than mine. God knows you're the only one who ever wanted to dig the drainage. When you're ready to come and look at it, or if you never are either way, I'll be there. Learning to see what you saw in those fields, however long it takes." He nodded to her and to Abigail, and he walked out of the courtroom into the square, where the whole county waited to know how it had ended, and Eleanor Carter watched him go, and did not call him back, and did not close the door either, and stood a long while in the emptied room with the cloth bundle in her arms, and something in her chest that was not quite hope and was no longer fear, and had for the first time in 4 years no name for what it was because it was too new to have earned one yet. The building was slow and quiet, and nobody admired him for it, and that was exactly how Eleanor knew it was real. Nathaniel kept his word. He did not send for her. In the weeks after the hearing, while Margaret Caldwell sat in the county jail awaiting the law's slow judgment and the whole county revised parlor by parlor, everything it had believed about the Carters, Eleanor stayed at the Monroe farm and waited to see, not what Nathaniel said, but what he did. For she had learned 4 years running that a man's words cost him nothing, and his habits told the whole truth. The first thing he did reached her by way of Dell, who came again in her hired trap on a Sunday, this time openly without fear, because there was no longer a Margaret Caldwell to fear. He's dismissed the overseer at Cedar Ford. Dell reported settling at Abigail's kitchen table with the ease of a woman who had decided she and Eleanor were friends, now whether Eleanor liked it or not. The one who drew wages for 4 men that never ate. Turned out the overseer was in it with her splitting the phantom wages he was all these years. Mr. Carter found it in the books himself, sat up 3 nights, and then he rode out to Cedar Ford and turned the man off his land. And do you know what he did after? What did he do? He hired the 4 men, Dell said. Real ones this time. 4 men who'd been begging work in Ashby Court, and he put them on at Cedar Ford at honest wages, and he told them plain. He said, "There've been 4 men's wages, leaving this place for years, going into a thief's pocket, and I mean to see that money finally buy 4 men's honest bread. And Mrs. Carter." Dell leaned forward. He did it without a soul to admire him for it. No party, no announcement. Just did it quiet because it was right. That's not the man I served for 20 years. That man never did a quiet thing in his life. Eleanor said nothing, but she turned it over a long while after Dell had gone. The second thing he did, she saw with her own eyes because it happened in town. She had gone into Ashby Court with Abigail on a market day, and the county's manner toward her had turned so completely that it was almost harder to bear than the coldness had been. The milliner's wife near tripped over herself, apologizing about the thread and the wrong change. Pressing an unwanted length of ribbon on Eleanor, as though a yard of ribbon could unsay 3 days of thin-lipped stares. Eleanor took it gently and forgave her plainly and moved on, because she had meant what she'd said in the courtroom about not spending her life reminding people of their smallness. And there outside the land office, she saw Nathaniel, and she saw him before he saw her, which is always the truest way to see a person. He was standing with 2 men she recognized as small farmers from the county's poorer end, the sort of men a Carter would ordinarily nod to and pass, and he was not passing them. He was listening. One of them, an anxious, weathered man named Tull, was saying something about a boundary line, a strip of bottomland the Carter estate had claimed years back that Tull swore had always been his father's, and the old Nathaniel would have had the man off his steps in a minute. This Nathaniel stood with his hat pushed back and his arms folded and his head tilted, listening the way a man listens who has learned lately, and at great cost, what it costs a person not to be listened to. "Bring me your father's old deed," Nathaniel said when Tull had finished. "Bring it round to the house, and we'll lay it beside the estate survey and see where the truth of it lies. If that bottomland's yours, Tull, it's yours, and I'll sign it back to you and be ashamed it took a Carter this long to look. And if it's mine, I'll show you why plain so you go home satisfied and not just silenced. Either way, you'll have looked at the papers with your own eyes. I'll not have another soul in this county taking my word for a thing they could see for themselves." Eleanor stood across the street and watched her husband say that, and she felt something shift in her chest that had been fixed in one cold position for 4 years. Because "I'll not have another soul take my word for a thing they could see for themselves" was not a thing Nathaniel Carter had learned from a lawyer or a judge or the loss of $4,000. It was a thing he had learned from a woman who had spent 4 years being told to take his word and Margaret's word and everyone's word, but the evidence of her own eyes, and he had turned that private wound of hers into a public principle of his, and he had done it not to win her back, for he did not know she was watching, but because it had gotten into him and changed how he stood in the world. He looked up then and saw her. And he did not startle, and he did not hurry across the street, and he did not put on any face. He simply touched his hat brim to her once across the width of the road, the small grave courtesy of a man greeting a woman he respects. And then he turned back to Tull and finished his business, because he'd told her he would not press. And a man who'd learned to listen had learned too that not pressing was its own kind of speaking. He didn't come over, Abigail observed, half puzzled, as they drove home. No, Eleanor said. He didn't. And she was quiet a mile before she added softly, more to herself than to Abigail. That's how I know he meant it. The third thing was the fields. It was Micah, the stable hand, who let it slip when he came to the Monroe farm to return a harness Nathaniel had borrowed from Abigail's late husband's stock. Micah was young and talked more than he ought, and while he was unhitching, he mentioned offhand that the master had gone strange about the south fields. Strange how? Eleanor asked, keeping her voice level. Walks 'em, ma'am, every morning near about dawn before the heat. Walks the whole south quarter with a notebook sketching drainage lines, he says, and where an orchard might go, and how the crop might rotate through the low ground. Micah shook his head, baffled. Talks to himself doing it. Heard him one morning, didn't mean to. I was after a strayed colt. He was standing out in the middle of the low field with his notebook, and he said, Micah stopped coloring. Beg pardon, ma'am. It ain't my place. Say it, Micah. He said she'd have seen it by now. She'd have seen it in a week, and I've been at it a month. Micah rubbed the back of his neck. That's all. Then he went back to sketching. Strange, like I said. But he's got the low field draining proper for the first time in anyone's memory. So I reckon, strange or no, he's on to something. Eleanor Carter went into the house after Micah had gone and sat down at Abigail's kitchen table and put her face in her hands. Not weeping, only holding very still because the man was walking the fields. She'd once walked full of plans, and failing to see what she'd seen, and knowing he was failing, and doing it anyway, every dawn for a month, with no one to admire him, and no promise she'd ever come back to find him at it. You could go and show him, Abigail said gently from the stove. You know, where the orchard goes. You had it all in your head years back. I know I could. Eleanor lowered her hands. That's not the question, Abby. The question was never whether he could change. I've seen enough now, the four men, the boundary, the fields. He's changed. I believe it. The question is whether I want to walk back into that house and spend the rest of my life as the woman who came back. Because there's a thing that happens to a woman who forgives Abby. The county files it away. She left, and then she came back. And every time there's a hard word between them. Ever after some part of everyone. Maybe some part of me thinks, well, she came back, once she'll bear it. Forgiveness can become a debt you spend the rest of your life repaying. And I didn't set a ring on a table and walk 8 miles down a July road to trade one silence for another. Abigail was quiet a moment. So what would it take? To go back and not be the woman who came back? And Eleanor Carter looked at her friend, and something settled in her face, some last piece coming to rest. It would take going back on terms, she said slowly. Not being asked back, not being forgiven back. Going back as a partner in a thing with my name on the papers, and my hand on the ledgers, and my ideas landing on the table instead of breaking on it. Not a wife restored to her husband's mercy. A woman come to run a place she's part owner of who happens to be married to the other owner. She stood. If I can go back as that, I'll go. If the only door open is the door marked forgiven wife who returned, then I love the man and I honor what he's become, and I'll wish him well from 8 miles off for the rest of my life, because I'll not unlearn in one summer what it took me 4 years to learn. And how? Abigail asked. Do you find out which door it is? I go and ask him, Eleanor said. Plain, the way I've done everything else. She went the next morning. She did not send word she had learned what waiting on other people's timing did to a woman, and she borrowed Abigail's mare and rode the 8 miles herself alone in the cool, before the heat, and she came up the long drive of Carter Hollow, for the first time since she'd walked down it, with nothing but a note left under a ring. He was in the south field. Of course he was. She saw him from the drive, a solitary figure out in the low ground with a notebook, and she left the mare at the fence and walked out to him across the very ground she'd once crossed full of plans, and he heard her coming and turned, and when he saw who it was, he went absolutely still, notebook forgotten in his hand. "Eleanor," he said, just her name. He did not move toward her. "Micah says you walk these fields every morning," she said, stopping a few feet off. "Sketching drainage. Looking for an orchard." "I do." He glanced down at the notebook as if embarrassed by it. "I can't find it, though, the thing you saw. I know it's here. You always said the low ground was the best of the whole estate, if a body would only drain it right. But I look, and I've not got the eye for it. I get the water off, but I can't see the shape of the thing, where the trees go, what follows what." He shook his head. "I've filled half a book with wrong guesses." "Show me," Eleanor said, and Nathaniel Carter looked at his wife standing in the middle of the south field in the early light, asking to see his wrong guesses, and something moved across his face that he did not try to hide. Hope and fear of the hope and the discipline, not to make too much of the moment. And he came and stood beside her, not too close, and he opened the notebook and held it where she could see. She looked at it a long time. He'd worked hard. That was plain. The drainage was sound better than sound. It was genuinely clever in places, a man teaching himself an art from the ground up. But the orchard was all wrong, planted in his sketches on the high, dry margin, where a carter would naturally put the pretty thing where folks driving up the lane would see it. "You've put the orchard where people will look at it," Eleanor said. "Well, yes, it's a fine sight, an orchard. I thought. That's the whole of your trouble right there, and it's the same trouble you had for 4 years. She said it without heat, almost gently. "You put the orchard where it'd be admired instead of where it'd bear. The high margins dry and thin, those trees'll struggle their whole lives to be looked at from the road. Put them here." She took the notebook from his hand and the pencil, and she crouched right down in the field and sketched quick and sure, the way she'd not been let to sketch anything in 4 years. "Here in the low ground you've just drained. Rich bottom soil sheltered from the west wind by the rise close to the water. Nobody driving the lane will see them for the swell of the hill. But they'll bear like nothing in this county, because you planted them where they'd thrive instead of where they'd show." She looked up at him. "And the rotation runs this way: corn here first year to break the ground, then the low field to legumes to feed it back, then let it come round. It follows the water, Nathaniel. Everything on this land wants to follow the water, and for 4 years this estate was run to follow the eye instead. That's your aunt's whole ledger in a sentence, come to think of it. Run to look right from the road." "Yeah." Nathaniel Carter crouched down beside his wife in the drained low field, and looked at what she'd drawn in 1 minute that he'd failed to find in a month, and he did not say, of course, and he did not say, "How did I not see it?" He only looked at it a long moment, and then he said very quietly, "Plant it where it'll bear, not where it'll show." He looked up at her. "You could have told me that 4 years ago. You'd have told me that 4 years ago if I'd have let an idea of yours land once. How many things did I lose, Eleanor? How many things did this place lose because I ran it to look right from the road and never once let you show me where the fruit would actually grow?" "A good many," Eleanor said honestly. "But they're not lost forever. That's the thing about land, Nathaniel. You can drain a field 10 years too late, and it'll still bear. It doesn't hold the wasted years against you. It only asks what you'll do with the ones left." She straightened and handed him back the notebook with her sketch in it. "The question is whether people are like land that way, whether a thing can start bearing again after it's been run wrong a long while. I don't know the answer to that one. I came to find out." He straightened too, and he understood that they had arrived out here in the field with no one to see at the real conversation, and he did not flinch from it. "Ask me," he said. "Whatever it is you came to ask, plain. I've learned to bear plain." "I'll not come back to be forgiven," Eleanor said. "I'll not come back to be your restored wife, the woman the county whispers left and came back about for the next 40 years, who bears a hard word because she owes it, because forgiveness got turned into a debt she's paying down till she dies. I'd sooner stay at Abby's the rest of my life than come back through that door." She held his eyes. "So I'll ask you plain, and you answer plain, and don't dress it up. If I come back, what do I come back as?" Nathaniel Carter was quiet a moment, and then he did a thing she did not expect. He reached into his coat and he took out not a ring, but a folded paper, and he held it out to her. "I had this drawn up a fortnight ago," he said, "by the lawyer in Ashby Court. I've been carrying it not because I meant to press you with it, but because I wanted it ready. If the day ever came, you asked me that exact question, so I'd not answer with words which you've every reason to distrust, but with a paper you can read with your own eyes and check with your own lawyer." He pushed it a little closer. "Read it." Eleanor took the paper and unfolded it, and she read it, and as she read it, her hands went slowly still. It was a deed of partnership. It made over to Eleanor Carter in her own name, in her own right, absolute and irrevocable 1/2 of Carter Hollow Estate, the land, the house, the whole of it to be hers, whether she lived in it or not, whether she stayed married to him or not, whether she ever spoke to him again or not. It gave her equal say in every decision touching the estate her signature required beside his on any sale, any loan, any contract forever. And at the bottom, in a clause the lawyer had plainly argued against it, said that in the event of any dispute between the two owners that could not be resolved, the deciding voice would be hers. "The lawyer near about had a fit over that last part," Nathaniel said quietly. "Said no man in Virginia gives his wife the casting vote over his own land. Said I'd be a fool and a laughingstock. I told him I'd been a laughingstock already when I let a thief run my books for 14 years, and it cost me a good deal more than pride." He met her eyes. "You asked what you'd come back as. Not a wife restored to my mercy, Eleanor. A partner with the deciding voice. Half owner, in fact, and in law. And if it ever comes to a hard word between us over this place, it's not my word that settles it. It's yours. Because I had 4 years of my word settling everything, and my word was wrong about the most important thing under my own roof, and I'll trust yours over mine the rest of my life. And I've put it on paper, so it's not a promise. I can quietly forget the way promises get forgotten. That's what you'd come back as. That's the only door I've got open. There isn't a forgiven wife door on this house anymore. I tore it off the hinges. This is the only way in." Eleanor Carter stood in the south field of Carter Hollow, holding a deed that made her half owner of the ground under her feet, with the deciding voice over the man who'd handed it to her. And for the first time since she was a girl, walking these fields full of plans, she felt the whole shape of her life turn from a thing done to her into a thing she would do. "You understand," she said, and her voice was not quite steady, "that I could take this paper and never come back. It's mine now, you said. Absolute and irrevocable. I could take half your estate and live at Abby's on the income and never speak to you again, and this deed would hold." "It'd hold," Nathaniel agreed. "I know it. The lawyer told me that too about 6 times. A faint rueful thing crossed his face. "That's rather the point of it, Eleanor. A gift you can only keep by staying isn't a gift, it's a leash. I didn't want to hand you a thing that bound you to me. I wanted to hand you a thing that set you free, all the way free, free enough to walk away rich and never look back, and then find out whether being that free, you'd choose to come back anyway. Because the only coming back worth having is the kind that isn't owed. You taught me that too, with the ring." He drew a breath. "You put a ring down to show me a woman can set down everything comfortable and pick up the truth. I'm handing you a deed to show you the same thing. Back here's everything comfortable. Here's half of everything I own with no string on it. Take it and go if you like. I'll not have you tied to me by anything but your own free choosing, because I had you tied by law and custom and your father's mortgage for 4 years, and I never once earned you, and I'd rather have you choose me for 1 day free than keep you bound for 40. Bah. And Eleanor Carter understood standing there that he had learned the whole of it. Not part, not the easy part, but the whole hard center of the thing she'd been trying to say for 4 years, and had finally had to say with a ring, because he'd never let her say it with words. That love without respect was only possession. That a thing held by force was not held at all. That the only voice worth having beside you was one that could leave and stayed anyway. She folded the deed. She did not hand it back. She put it inside her own coat against her own chest where he'd carried his little book of Margaret's crimes, and she saw him watch her do it, and saw him understand that whatever came next, the deed was hers now, and would stay hers. "I'll keep this," she said, "in my own name. And I'll have my own lawyer read it, not yours, because a partner checks the papers herself and doesn't take the other owner's word for what's in them." "You should," Nathaniel said. "You ought to. I'd think less of you if you didn't." "And then," Eleanor said slowly, "I'll come back. Not today, not this week, when my lawyer's read it and I've had my say on the harvest plan, and we've settled how the accounts get kept by both of us in the open, on a table where any hand at this estate can come and see the books. Because there'll be no more locked ledgers on this land while I've got half say in it, then I'll come back, as a partner, to a place that's half mine, married to the other owner." She looked at him steadily. "And understand me, Nathaniel, because I'll say it once, and then we'll neither of us speak of it again. I'm not coming back because you gave me the deed. If the deed were all it was, I'd take it and stay at Abby's, and you'd have bought yourself an absent partner and a clear conscience and nothing else. I'm coming back because of the 4 men at Cedar Ford you hired quiet with no one to admire you. Because of Tull's boundary line, and I'll not have a soul take my word for a thing they can see for themselves. Because of a month of walking these fields at dawn, failing to find the orchard, and doing it anyway. The deed's only paper. Those are the things that told me the man changed. The deed just tells me he means to keep it up." Nathaniel Carter stood in his field, their field now, and did not trust himself to speak for a moment. "There's one more thing," he said finally, and his voice was rough. "I've carried it since the morning you left, and I don't rightly know what to do with it. And I'll put it in your hand, and you'll do with it whatever you see fit, and I'll not say a word either way." He reached again into his coat, and this time it was the ring, the plain gold band she'd set beside his plate 4 years and a lifetime ago. "I never put it away. I've carried it since that morning. Not to give back to you. I've no right to give it back. And a ring given back is just another thing a man decides for a woman. I only wanted you to have the choosing of it the same as the deed. It's yours. It was always yours. Wear it. Don't wear it. Throw it in the low field. For all I care about the ring itself, it's the choosing I care about. That's the only part that was ever worth anything." He held it out on his open palm, and did not close his hand, and did not reach toward her. Eleanor Carter looked at the ring on her husband's open palm. She remembered the weight of it on her finger through 4 years of silence. She remembered the small sound it had made against the breakfast cloth. She remembered walking down the Richmond Road with her hand feeling strange and light and free. And she remembered, too, the woman she'd been the first month of that marriage, before the frost, walking these very fields, full of plans, hopeful and unheard. She did not take the ring right away. She stood and looked at it a long moment, and she let him wait, and she was not being cruel. She was doing the one thing she had never once been permitted to do under that roof, which was to take her own time over her own choice, with no one hurrying her toward the answer that suited them. And then Eleanor Carter reached out, and she took the ring from her husband's palm, and she looked at it in her own fingers, and she made her choice. And when she made it out loud, so there could be no mistaking it, and no one ever after could say it had been decided for her. "I'll wear it," she said. "But hear me, Nathaniel, and hear me plain, because this is the last plain thing I'll have to say, and after this, we start the ordinary quiet talking that married partners do. I'm not putting this ring back on because I'm your wife returned. I'm putting it on because a woman who owns half this ground, who's had a lawyer of her own read the deed, who's got the deciding voice in every dispute, and her name required on every paper, and the books kept open on a table where God and every field hand can see them. That woman is free enough to wear whatever she chooses. 4 years ago, this ring meant I belong to you. Today it means I'm choosing to build something with a man I own half of it with. It's the same gold, it is not the same ring, and it never will be again." And she put it on, her own hand, her own choice. In an open field with no county watching, and no judge presiding, and no one at all to admire it, which was the only way it could ever have meant what it meant. Nathaniel Carter looked at the ring on his wife's finger, put there by her own hand, for her own reasons, and he did not seize her hand, and he did not weep, and he did not make a speech, because he had learned at last that the largest moments are the ones you don't crowd. He only nodded once, slow, a man accepting a gift he knew he had not earned and meant to spend the rest of his life earning backward. "Then we'd best get to work," he said. "Partner, the low field won't drain itself, and you've an orchard to lay out where the fruit'll actually grow, and I'll want your hand on the harvest accounts by week's end because I keep the books wrong. I keep them to look right, you said, and I reckon I'll be a while unlearning it, and I'll need watching." A pause. "I'll always need watching, Eleanor. I know myself now well enough to know that. A man who ran his whole life to be admired doesn't cure of it in a summer. But I'd rather be watched by you than admired by the whole county. And that's the truest thing I've got. And I'll build on it every day. You'll let me, and some days you won't, and I'll not stop building it, even if you never do come all the way back." "I'm coming all the way back," Eleanor said. "I decided it when I saw the orchard in your wrong little sketches, and knew you'd been out here a month trying to see what I see." She almost smiled, the first almost smile he'd had from her in longer than either could remember. "But you'll keep needing the watching. I'll give you that gladly. It's a great deal better work than being unheard." They walked back across the south field together toward the house, the drained low ground on one side where the orchard would go, and bear the honest new hired men, visible far off at their labor. The whole estate lying around them no longer run to look right from the road, but beginning slow and quiet to be run to bear. And Eleanor Carter did not walk behind her husband the way she had for 4 years. And she did not walk beneath his name the way the county had always expected. She walked beside him, level her hand with the ring on it swinging free at her side, and the deed to half of everything folded against her heart. A partner coming home to a place that was hers, and she had not been rescued, and she had not been forgiven, and she had not been restored to anyone's mercy. She had been heard, she had been believed. She had been made an equal in law, and in fact, and in the deciding voice over every acre of ground beneath her feet. And she had chosen freely, with every door standing open behind her, and half a fortune in her pocket, to walk away with, to build a life with the man who had finally learned that the only voice worth having beside you is the one that could leave and stays. A woman who finds her voice can rebuild her life on her own terms, and answer to no one for the choosing. And Eleanor Carter had found hers, and used it, and would never again set it down for any man, any house, or any name on this earth.